but the concept of, like in Tiamat, chaos, or the concept of misrule is something that must have been perceived by society that was hidebound in regulation, in authority, in conformity, and so on. And to see that possibly people can potter about quite happily without all that regulatory nonsense, that they can actually be able to see what is right and have what is right burnt into their hearts and stuff in Jesus. So that is the kingdom of God, that's the kingdom of heaven. It is the ideal, and that, I think, is what we are about. We are trying, through science, through education, not through silly mumbo-jumbo or new age occultism, but through proper scientific research and education, we are trying to offer that capability once more.
Well, I remember, I think the original intent of the Declaration of Independence here in the United States, or it wasn't even called that back then, but the idea was that they were going to separate from the sovereignty of the British monarch and essentially institute a government of sovereigns here where every man was a sovereign. Now, that didn't work out. They didn't end up doing that, really. They changed the understanding of the law pretty quickly. But
do you remember a couple of weeks ago I asked if anyone could dig out Lysander Spooner? Brian Jade did a brilliant job of it, and Spooner said that anything like the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, it must be signed up for by each generation, not expecting the generation that established it to continue those laws on for decades or centuries and make other people conform to any Declaration of Independence. Spooner said that it is generationally consensual, and each generation has to be able to say yes or no, because otherwise democracy is not democracy at all, it's totalitarian.
Otherwise you have the assumption that someone else owns you, basically.
Absolutely.
If someone were to join Drakkenberg...
Alright, it's 1:07, November 25th. I'm going to read Jade, Helm, 15, Black Operation. And I'm going to talk about a lot of different things that have kind of come up in my thinking about this and rereading. And, you know, another reason I kind of am doing this is because things keep coming up that kind of relate in this whole... I mean, I just found out about this like within this last month or so, but apparently this goes back about a year. But DHS and this whole biometric like identity software type thing is being in like they had a contract with Northrop Grumman, and I found it odd that it's called the Homeland Advanced Recognition Technology System, or the HART system, because again, H or Hey, Aleph, Resh, Tau, Samek is 666, and so I don't know whether or not people do this on purpose or whether it's just, you know, a coincidence. But at the same time, like in 2015, Jade Helm 15, I was kind of like contemplating the same question. And Jade Helm with mem final and then +1 +5 is also 666 military drill code. And the reason I want to talk about like a few other things is because this ties in with the last few posts and a few in the future. And I was reading The Dragon Legacy by Nicholas de Vere, which Tracy Twyman wrote an intro to, and it's got a lot of weird stuff, like takes. Some of it's interesting, some of it's a little questionable, but the first few chapters, like, there's just a lot of background, I guess. But I found it odd that, I guess, chapter, 4 or 5, or I guess 6. It ends up talking a lot about the Labyrinth, and it talks about this like tribe called the Danon, and Danon stood out to me, and it's 107. But they also talk about the Leah Fail, which is this sort of like stone, which is also 107. And so again, this like literal egg that came to me on April 2nd, 2011, and then I later realized was the one, like that year was the 107th year of the Eon of Horus, and pretty much all the things Frater Chad and Kenneth Grant wrote about 107 started coming up, and so to find it yet again is, so I guess it's not that surprising because, I don't know, it's just, again, when I was reading this chapter on the way back from Colorado, like a few weeks ago, and I was like, holy shit, this goes really well with pretty much this, a lot of the, again, the concepts of this black iron prison, or this simulacra, this sort of like artificial overlay or hologram or digital sort of like the internet itself, and the implications of that. Like NSA, the database of all this information, is also 111, and they want to create this battlefield simulation with, that's what the whole Jade Helm thing was, but then the initials for the Black Iron Prison is also 111, Malkuth itself. And so I was like, this whole labyrinth concept started coming up in that Occult Computer Science video and in the Dagobert's Revenge magazines themselves. Tracy Twyman refers to the labyrinth and Hades and Poseidon, and there's like a lot of connections there. But again, the creator of the labyrinth, Daedalus, is 111. And just mathematically, that's the 1, the 10, the 100, or 10 times 10. It's this unfoldment of, or expansion of the 1. And so all the triple numbers, what I've been finding is that this whole concept goes back to, what's his name? This whole concept ties in with Arthur Koestler's, not just The Ghost in the Machine, which apparently goes back to this Gilbert Ryle, but the holon and holarchy, which, like, pretty much it's connected to the whole idea of holistic, but it just means whole. So the part, and like a hole in the part, and that's why he like linked it to Janus, the Greek god of, like, with the two faces facing backwards and forwards or in and out, because the holon being a sort of a fractal hierarchy. Well, the holarchy is a fractal hierarchy. The holon is just a sort of like fractal bit or a fractal unit. And there's also Douglas Hofstadter's concept of the strange loop. And it's funny, like, because I was just talking about the mirror and that sort of recursive loop, and how the mirror and the event horizon and the point in the center kind of symbolizes the Tao and the circle and the Mahayana and Zen, and pretty much it's the same thing in the strange loop. And so I've known of Douglas Hofstadter's work, like meta-magical themas, and it's funny because I found his thing about the Rubik's Cube really interesting. He talks a lot about it, but the Rubik's Cube itself is 333, using Gimel for, like, in the most basic format for C. And 333 obviously illustrates that sort of, like, you know, the grid, and but also the fact that the solution, like, again, lottery, the fact that things just fall into place, and or the idea of that sort of wheel and the spin and the chance in a way. All these concepts, not just metamagical themas, but what's his other book? Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And so again, the Escherian like staircases and the recursive, like the hand drawing itself. I saw it somewhere. But anyway, all these concepts are very important and integrated, like this maze, the whole idea of the maze, and again, Ghost in the Machine, it talks about the radomorphic view of man, or this whole concept of, again, the ghost in the machine, or the rat in the maze, and the rat in the maze test, which is just that sort of common test. There's a lot of labyrinthine sort of things. The whole, essentially, what I wanted to read this chapter for, along with the blog itself, is because he ends up like associating the labyrinth with the tree of life, and the paths of the tree of life are like the paths or the passages in the labyrinth, or the passages of the labyrinth. And but those passages are also states of cognition, and it's just weird, all these different sort of mythological analogies. So anyway, I don't know which to read first, but because there's all these different tie-ins. I mean, again, the fact that we have these different manifestations, or again, all these different sort of recurrences, and even the fact that all these different things overlay within a single number, or it's like a superimposition, is again like levels of the labyrinth, or these cycles of, which again in like Buddhism, the cycles, which again cycles is 111, or again Aleph is 111, but when you go around a track or a circuit or a cycle, it's called a lap. So that's 111. And so I'm just trying to think. Basically, and wheels within wheels, WHEELS. And then the veils. So 111 shows the sort of veils of density, which again get fleshed out in a sort of cycle. And but again, at the heart of it all, at the heart of the circle, is that sort of empty void in a way, like the Buddhists consider it, but not that it's necessarily empty. It's more that it's got such a potential that it's continuous. So anyway, this 111 thing, it's also in Hebrew like bright light or brilliance, like blinding, dazzling brilliance, but also thick darkness. And so to me, that shows that spectrum that Crowley sort of talks about white and black being essentially not two, but one in some way. Obviously, it's the spectrum itself. And so again, kundal, the root of kundali or kundalini means coil, kundal. And so the coil in Malkuth, it's kind of, it all kind of sinks in once you know about it and like go around the cycle yourself. But so again, there's all these different articles about the heart system, and it's just, one more example. But this whole black box theory of consciousness also came up with, again, the Rubik's Cube, the sort of lament configuration and Hellraiser idea of, or even what's that one movie, Mulholland Drive, the sort of box, this black box, and it's like the monolith in 2001 even, In a sense, it's like Doth. And so again, Doth being however you want to consider it. But when you consider the first, like the supernal triad, the first three, 620 plus 73 plus 67 plus 474, 1,234. And that's like the tetractys. But the word quintessence, so again, the fifth element, this sort of box that is constructed, that again is like a holographic hypercube, and creates a sort of reflection I don't know, it's a weird, I know it's hard to comprehend, I guess, what I'm saying, but essentially the ego function itself, all this is Kabbalistic in nature, but there's a split or a schism somewhere along the line to account for the whole identity thing and the ego itself. But they say that that's all illusory anyway. So again, the 107 being identity, but also the XYZ or field of the bubbles. But again, the 4 separating the white light in a way, Malkuth. I don't know. I see it all just Kabbalistically, metaphorically, but this whole black box concept of where the mind starts and stops, and this whole concept of free will and determinism, and it's very interesting to me. But so what else did I have pulled up? Hippocampus. They call it the seahorse, but they also say it's like a sea monster is another definition, Campos monster. And so again, the hippocampus governs memory, and what was I'm trying to remember. Because there's actually 2, campoi, hippocampi, yeah, so that's 384, which is also so memory is 365, which is how many days are in the year. But then there's maybe it's Atharva Veda Samhita, which is this ancient Hindu Samhita or text for like daily practice, and it's one of the most ancient sort of texts on magic, and it recently came up. But when you add so the Atharva Veda Samhita, all these things kept coming up as 384 there for like quite a while, there for a week or so. I kept seeing 384s everywhere. Even like this coffee was 384. And I was just like, okay, so it's little things like that it's like, okay, maybe I should just consider what it is and memorize it, And so the memory is hippocampi. And 384, but also 385 is important, because if you consider all the sum of all the cubes from like 1 through 10, 10 times 10, it's 100, plus 9 times 9, 81, all the way down to 1. The 1 makes 384, 385. And 385 has its own sort of, obviously, correspondences, like every number does. But I'm starting to see the actual geometrical, like, sort of shapes and yantras and mandalas that they sort of make, that each number is capable of, I guess. And that's why 793 kept coming up, and it even came up with this whole labyrinth thing. But basically, I don't know, this is all I see it slowly leading into the next post, which deals with the dark doorway of the beast, or dark doorway of the beast. But this hippocampus as a cognitive map, there's a whole book on this. But in mythology, again, it's the sea monster or seahorse. And so again, the Minotaur comes to mind, but also Merodach or Murdoch, this sort of beast of the sea. I don't know, this whole brain, the neuroscience aspect of all this is very interesting. And 384 is also related to, obviously, the I Ching or the I Ching, the hexagrams having 6 lines. So 64 times 6 being 384. And so, yeah, again, the Atharva Veda Samhita being knowledge, storehouse, the procedures for everyday life. And this all slowly led me to find out about this thing called the Lankavatara Sutra, which is all this stuff, again, I'll talk about more in the next post. But I just wanted to kind of go over some of this stuff to make sure that it's sort of fresh in my mind whenever I'm reading the blog post and that chapter. If I can find it. Alright, so I said, it should have been addressed sooner, but further investigation was necessary for a wider outlook on this topic and its references and connections. As has been shown throughout many articles in this publication, the art and practice of using gematria, counting letters and words according to their numerical placement value, is a very effective method of concealing, transmitting, and unveiling codes, formulas, or correspondences done either intentionally or unintentionally. Now the time has arrived to show how this is done on a wide scale and in a modern form, such as in certain major psychological operations currently in effect. Note that as far back as 1984, there were already plans and preparations regarding the illegal imprisonment of government dissidents in concentration camps throughout the country. The dark and dismal subject of warfare, martial law, and some of the more Saturnian aspects of this material plane, such as those covered in Enemy Number 1, the factors of balance, the mechanization of man, etc., are necessary to focus on now because they are the external manifestation of collective errors and pathologies needed to be worked through and neutralized. Otherwise, they will merely grow to be worse. Analyzing yet again with the same formula I've been using thus far, we see that the latest military program being discussed lately is Jade Helm 15, or now the Heart system, and it follows the same military drill code we see consistently. Jade Helm plus 1 plus 5 equals 666 using mem final, as per the original Hebrew method of calculation applied to English. Note again also that apply Hebrew to English is also 666. This is something that is very peculiar, as it raises the question as to whether those that came up with the code knew this formula, or perhaps if they didn't, then again, this would be a case of unintentionally or unconsciously carrying a particular pattern, resonance, or charge. Note, resonance can equal 444 and charge can be 222. In either case, the gematria is still accurate and useful for decoding things as they may arise, thus proving its practical efficacy and importance, at least for consideration. This is exactly what I've been talking about, and now is a chance to better illustrate the scenario and attempt to show that countermeasures can be taken to, again, balance this knowledge and power and prevent further corruption and manipulation. Furthermore, the subject of quantum computing and AI has also been touched upon previously, and this plays an important role in this black operation, as Jade Helm is apparently running concurrently with the rollout of yet another expansion of the U.S. military AI technology, as the Joint Assistant for Development and Execution, or JADE, developed by BBN Technologies and Raytheon. See AFRL IFRS TR 2001-171 Final Technical Report. And from the John B. Wells radio program at episode 309, Jade is an AI quantum computing technology that produces holographic battlefield simulations and has the ability to use vast amounts of data being collected on the human domain to generate human terrain systems in geographic population-centric locations to identify and eliminate targets, insurgents, rebels, or whatever labels can be flagged as targets in a global information grid for network-centric warfare environments. The Jade 2 battlefield system is cognitive and intuitive. It can examine prior executed battle plans and devise new and better strategies to increase the kill chain. The second generation of Jade has the capability for two-way communication with drones through the OCCOM technology, which is one of the next generation integrations to this system. In short, Jade Helm will not be battles directed by generals and military commanders, but by a computer. It is a cognitive software program based on a network-centric warfare system at the helm. And this concept of the helm actually also comes up in The Ghost in the Machine by Arthur Koestler, which this book, it's kind of, I don't know, it goes into so many different things, and then plus it connects to a few other of his books, or a few of his other books, The Act of Creation, but also The Control of the Mind Symposium, which I'll put a link to that because it's actually really interesting. But Arthur Koestler has so many books, and they're all really good in my opinion, or at least they're a lot of food for thought, and yet there's like very little information about him and very few videos on YouTube. And so I've had to get all of his books, and I want to slowly work through certain ones that I'm not familiar with. And then even his fiction seems really interesting, especially, Twilight Bar. I just have had so much other stuff to do and deal with. But The Ghost in the Machine is a 1967 book about philosophical psychology by Arthur Koestler. The title is a phrase, see Ghost in the Machine, coined by Oxford philosopher Gilbert Ryle to describe the Cartesian dualist account of the mind-body relationship. Koestler shares with Ryle the view that the mind of a person is not an independent, non-material entity temporarily inhabiting and governing the body. The work attempts to explain humanity's self-destructive tendency in terms of individual and collective functioning, philosophy, and overarching cyclical political historical dynamics, peaking in the nuclear weapons arena. So, in an attempt to explain human violence, Koestler criticizes the dominant conceptions of psychology of his time, behaviorism, B.F. Skinner and the Skinner School, that postulate that human behaviors are subject to the selection of the fittest. For him, this theory echoed the Darwinian conceptions of the evolution of species. The book contributes also to the long-standing debate surrounding the mind-body problem and focusing in particular on René Descartes' dualism in the form elucidated by Ryle. Koestler's materialistic account argues that the personal experience of duality arises from what Koestler calls a holon. The notion of a holon emerges from the observation that everything in nature is both a whole and a part. It is true for atoms who are a whole in themselves, but also a part of a molecule. Of atom who could be a whole and part of a cell, of cells who both an autonomous unity and part of an organism. It is also true for human beings who have an independent life and are part of social systems. Every holon is willing to express two contradictory tendencies, to express himself and to disappear in something greater. For humans, those tendencies lead to an error in development. We create collective units that are based on the oppression of some individuals and on the inflated egos of others. This is for Koestler an error of transcendence that is reflected in a poor integration of our reptilian brain and cognitive brain. A superposition of forces manifests at each bodily holon as the outcome of an entire hierarchy of forces, ontogenetic, habitual, linguistic, prescriptive, and social science, operating in a continuum of independent feedback and feed-forward streams of a body extended to its larger environment. The streams are fed by the life signals of each and every group member, and this fully participative medley is the spirit of life one senses as a ghost. But this spirit is just a simplified output of a complex knowledge set. It is emergent from the complexity of the group's rules and strategies. He contrasts his basic approach to the mind-body problem with behaviorism's basic approach to the problem. Following the whole on of humanity down to its roots, the work explains humanity's tendency towards self-destruction in terms of brain structure, philosophies, and its overarching cyclical political historical dramas reaching the height of its potential in the nuclear arms arena. One of the book's central concepts is that as the human triune brain has evolved, it is retained and built upon earlier, more primitive brain structures. The head portion of the ghost in the machine has, as a consequence of poor, inadequate connections, a rich potential for conflict. The primitive layers can and may together overpower rational logic's hold. This explains a person's hate, anger, and other such emotional distress. In Janus, a summing up, Koestler continues the theories developed in The Ghost in the Machine and further elaborates on the concept of holarchy. So yeah, I wish I could read this whole book right now, but obviously I can't. But I'm surprised there's not, again, more discussion of it. But The Ghost in the Machine is British philosopher Gilbert Ryle's description of René Descartes' mind-body dualism. Ryle introduced the phrase in The Concept of Mind in 1949 to highlight the view of Descartes and others that mental and physical activity occur simultaneously but separately. Gilbert Ryle was a philosopher who lectured at Oxford and made important contribution to the philosophy of mind and to ordinary language philosophy, which is a philosophical methodology that sees traditional philosophical problems as rooted in misunderstandings philosophers develop by distorting or forgetting what words actually mean in everyday use. Ryle's The Concept of Mind critiques the notion that the mind is distinct from the body and refers to the idea as the ghost in the machine. According to Ryle, the classical theory of mind, or Cartesian rationalism, makes a basic category mistake because it attempts to analyze the relation between mind and body as if they were terms of the same logical category. This confusion of logical categories may be seen in other theories of the relation between mind and matter. For example, the idealist theory of mind makes a basic category mistake by attempting to reduce physical reality to the same status as mental reality, while the materialist theory of mind makes a basic category mistake by attempting to reduce mental reality to the same status as physical reality. So again, this whole psychosomatic conundrum is interesting because it seems like there's a sort of the Buddhists and the Hindus, they have interesting takes on how our sense of self is like an illusion. But Gödel, Escher, Bach pretty much also concerns itself with how like consciousness arises from, material or matter or seemingly unconscious systems, at least. I don't know. A lot of people have like problems with this book. If you read the reviews, they're like, there's no point. And I think that's kind of the point, is that it's the whole recursion idea is that it's kind of, it's hard to find that like seam in the paradox. But again, seam, it's kind of like sum, but the mem final is also 666. So seeing that or finding that seam is, again, it's like finding that magnetic energy center, or where that circle, where the snake eats its tail. But Gödel, Escher, Bach, an eternal golden braid, also known as Jeb, which, again, I had pulled up, I think. Bess, and Bess backwards as Seb is Jeb. Jeb being pretty much like Malkuth or the Earth. Find that in like the counterpart to Nuit in a way. But then Bess being the sort of like he's kind of like the dwarf god according to Kenneth Grant. But yet the dwarf and the giant, the great old ones, kind of go back and forth, it seems like. And so there's all these different like relational connections that no one kind of anticipates, but they just exist. And so again, it's like that labyrinth or the cyclical recurrence along that sort of samsara. But by exploring common themes in the lives and works of logician Kurt Gödel, artist M.C. Escher, and composer Johann Sebastian Bach, the book expounds concepts fundamental to mathematics, symmetry, and intelligence. Through illustration and analysis, the book discusses how, through self-reference and formal rules, systems can acquire meaning despite being made of meaningless elements. It also discusses what it means to communicate, how knowledge can be represented and stored, the methods and limitations of symbolic representation, and even the fundamental notion of meaning itself. And so again, this is another book that's like I can only just point to and hope people read. It's kind of funny that it has 777 pages. But in response to confusion over the book's theme, Hofstadter emphasizes that Gödel Escher Bach is not about the relationships of mathematics, art, and music, but rather about how cognition emerges from hidden neurological mechanisms. One point in the book presents an analogy about how individual neurons in the brain coordinate to create a unified sense of a coherent mind by comparing it to the social organization displayed in a colony of ants. The tagline, a metaphorical fugue on minds and machines in the spirit of Lewis Carroll, was used by the publisher to describe the book. And so, again, this book is so all over the place, but it does end up leading to I Am a Strange Loop, which itself, like again, the strange loop concept is it's kind of difficult to understand, I guess, but it's also very simple. And I think that he does, I think it's in this one, he relates like Zen koans or koans, which again, Taoism, there's these like sort of paradoxes or contradictions that give you a sort of insight into the sort of the play of reality in a way, like it's kind of hard to explain, but a strange loop is a hierarchy of levels. So again, this whole holarchy or nested, a nested something, I don't remember, but each of which is linked to at least one other by some type of relationship. A strange loop hierarchy is tangled. Hofstadter refers to this as a heterarchy, in that there is no well-defined highest or lowest level. Moving through the levels, one eventually returns to the starting point, i.e. the original level. Examples of strange loops that Hofstadter offers include many of the works of M.C. Escher, the Canon 5 A2 from Bach's musical offering, the information flow network behind DNA and enzymes through protein synthesis and DNA replication, and self-referential Gödelian statements in formal systems. In I Am a Strange Loop, Hofstadter defines strange loops as follows. And yet, when I say strange loop, I have something else in mind, a less concrete, more elusive notion. What I mean by strange loop is, here goes a first stab anyway, not a physical circuit, but an abstract loop in which, in a series of stages that constitute the cycling around, there is a shift from one level of abstraction or structure to another that feels like an upward movement in a hierarchy and yet somehow the successive upward shifts turn out to give rise to a closed cycle. That is, despite one's sense of departing ever further back from one's origin, one winds up, to one's shock, exactly where one had started out. In short, a strange loop is a paradoxical, level-crossing feedback loop. And so, again, all this is like a lot of verbal, mumbo jumbo, I guess, but it's, if you can cognize what it's talking about, this whole, again, the downward causality, that's interesting with that 384 and 385, because some of the concepts of that, like 384 is also pranayama, and pranayama is that energy, or the flow of the breath. And so this central channel of the one coming into play, it's hard to explain by just talking directly about it, but 666 and the triple numbers themselves being these sort of marmas of completeness or fullness, it makes them kind of difficult to, they're kind of deceptive, because again being seam, the seam, it's clear, it's like, again, it's the fact, it's very deceptive when something aligns to that, because it's so clear and flat that it's flush, it's like it's hard to not just see as being a little too perfect. So but it's in a way, it's just that thing coming full circle. And so this whole strange loop, labyrinth, Rubik's cube, holarchy, holon, it's all kind of the same thing, it seems like. And even these different mythologies, and again, the mythology of the labyrinth, it's just different cyclings. The Amduat, which is that which is in the afterworld, or the underworld. The text of the hidden chamber, which is in the underworld. The book of what is in the underworld, is an important ancient Egyptian funerary text of the new kingdom of Egypt. Like many funerary texts, it was found written on the inside of the pharaoh's tomb for reference. And the reason I bring this up is because Amduat in its lowest form with Teth is 61, which again is Ain, the sort of the void, but it's also 12, and there's 12 steps in the Amduat, just like there's 12 steps or hours in the day. What else? Kali, the goddess of, nighttime and the void and death, the underworld. There's a few different things I'm trying to think of, but unlike other funerary texts, however, it was reserved only for the pharaohs, or for very favored nobility. It tells the story of Ra, the Egyptian sun god who travels through the underworld, from the time when the sun sets in the west and rises again in the east. It is said that the dead pharaoh is taking this same journey, ultimately to become one with Ra and live forever. The underworld is divided into 12 hours of the night, each representing different allies and enemies for the pharaoh or sun god to encounter. The Amduat names all of these gods and monsters. The main purpose of the Amduat is to give the names of these gods and monsters to the spirit of the dead pharaoh so he can call upon them for help or use their name to defeat them, as well as enumerating and naming the inhabitants of the Duat, which again is like Doth, or the underworld, both good and bad. The illustrations of the work show clearly the topography of the underworld. The earliest complete version of the Amduat is found in KV 34. Valley of the Kings was the tomb of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Thutmose III, the tomb of Thutmose III in the Valley of the Kings. And so the hours, in hour 1, the sun god enters the western horizon, Akhet, which is a transition between day and night. In hours 2 and 3, he passes through an abundant watery world called Wernes and the waters of Osiris. In hour 4, he reaches the difficult sandy realm of Sokar, the underworld hawk deity, where he encounters dark, zigzag pathways, which he has to negotiate, being dragged on a snake boat. In Hour 5, he discovers the Tomb of Osiris, which is an enclosure beneath which is hidden a lake of fire. The tomb is covered by a pyramid-like mound identified with the goddess Isis, and on top of which Isis and Nephthys have alighted in the form of two kites, or birds of prey. In the 6th hour, the most significant event in the underworld occurs. The Ba, or soul of Ra, unites with his own body, or alternatively with the Ba of Osiris within the circle formed by the Mehen serpent. This event is the point at which the sun begins its regeneration. It is a moment of great significance, but also danger, as beyond it, in Hour 7, the adversary Apep, or Apophis, lies in wait and has to be subdued by the magic of Isis, and the strength of Set, assisted by Serket. Once this has been done, the sun god opens the doors of the tomb in Hour 8 and then leaves the sandy island of Sokar by rowing vigorously back into the waters in Hour 9. In Hour 10, the regeneration process continues through immersion in the waters until Hour 11, the god's eyes, a symbol for his health and well-being, are fully regenerated. In Hour 12, he enters the eastern horizon ready to rise again as the new day's sun. And so the fact that that was only known to pharaohs, if you read about Sobek, he is associated with the pharaohs, and let's see, what's it say? Sobek enjoyed a long-standing presence in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. He is first known from several different pyramid texts. The spell which praises the pharaoh as the living incarnation of the crocodile god reads, Eunice is Sobek, green of plumage, with alert face and raised fore, the splashing one who came from his thigh and tail of the great goddess in the sunlight. Sobek in Egyptian is debated among scholars, but many believe that it is derived from a causative of the verb to impregnate. And so again, Sobek has, again, many names. Suchus, I forgot what else, it's in here somewhere, but again, Sobek can be 333, which he's related to the lizard, or the dragon, but Dracon, Saurus, the dinosaur, the Lacertus, the lizard, or the Lagarto, or no wait, which one was it? Lagarto. Yeah, the Lagarto. But Sobek is apparently, he was related even with Horus himself. But the Fayum region, the land of the lake, Lake Moeris, it's the center of Sobek, basically. And if you read in this book about the maze and the mazes and labyrinths, I guess it's right here. It talks about this legendary labyrinth lost in the Fayum area, and they think it's under this Hawara pyramid or mound. But as to whether it is or not, no one really knows. But there's a lot of connections, again, with 777 and the labyrinth. And so the Giza pyramids being 666 and the whole solar thing, the labyrinth being a slightly deeper dimension or a dimensional shift, or again this sort of strange loop, holonic level or shift. It's just an interesting thing to contemplate. And again, 777, it came up in a few other ways, and so while I'm thinking about it, this movie, The 13th Floor, which the band Helm, who I've liked for ever since I was a kid, they mentioned 666. I actually saw them on June 6th, 2006, and that was the first concert I ever went to. But they mention 666, but also 777 in this song For You. They did the song Join Me in Death for this movie, which was apparently filmed at 777, this 777 tower in Los Angeles. And I mean, none of this was, I'm sure, like really planned to coincide. It just happens. But then in this song, Death is in Love with Us, he mentions 41 plus 66.6, which is 107.6, but oops, 41 plus 66.6. And I've looked it up. No one seems to really know what it's about, but yet another 107. Mantra, like this whole concept kind of, again, with 777, cymatics, general semantics, it's all a little too much. And I had this video, I'll play it here in a minute, but this whole labyrinth concept, again, it's all about kind of the subconscious mind, or a sort of simulacra of the mind. And that's what this whole 111 and again 666 kind of have to do with. But then 999 being the hyperdimensional matrix, 777, 888, 999 being these, that added extra 333, or basically, I don't know, it's hard to explain what I see this all symbolizing, other than that we see this sort of cube, this three-dimensional box we're in, but it seems like there is a sort of hyperdimensional reality of past, present, and future, and a lot of our systems and even consciousness generally itself is geared towards that limited frame and anticipation and understanding, whereas it's really, again, it's like toroidal. So the things in the past that we do, again, and the things in the present, alter the things in the future. And so the more you understand about all that, it's like cultivating a garden or a flower itself, however you want to, mythologize it. Anyway, I need to keep reading this. This technology is not new. It is merely being gradually put into the open. Again, the externalization of the hierarchy. The idea is to have smart appliances, homes, cars, and eventually body modification devices. The whole aspect regarding martial law is one aspect of this operation, and it is multifaceted. Part of it is to data mine and see who will be reactionary to these global changes. Another is to condition and desensitize, while also essentially assimilating people to the New World Order. Again, this phrase is a bit worn out at this point, but that is essentially what this is and has been the whole time, and many people throughout the recent years of history have used it pretty liberally, as it is an incremental process and has been in effect for numerous generations. See Occult Theocracy or, any other book. The common factor in the past as well as the present scenarios and agendas is that for these programs to work so well, the general public has to be, for the most part, unaware of the greater scheme of things, while at the same time subconsciously driven to embrace and further the directives they've been given through the various input channels. In the case of Jade Helm 15, the general public knows little of the greater scheme of the context and long-term aim of the agenda, but the fact it is being made public to a certain degree and is said to be an urban terrain operation, it is obviously a mixture between an overt and covert drill, with its overt out-in-the-open aspects being still a part of testing and training, to once again gauge the effects and reactions they cause in the general public. And that's what I saw it as, was just a sort of like a gaslighting to sort of cause, like, again, this was back when Obama was still president and there was like preppers, and I mean, there still are preppers and all that, but just people who were kind of, a little threatening, I guess, to some of these people. But The reason I wanted to write about this subject is because while people want practical ideas, I want to show how these currents and codes are practically everywhere and being used by some people you'd least expect, such as the military-industrial complex, or at least you'd think to least expect. If you really want some practice, take a look around and see how much these subliminal word codes carry certain charges, which themselves can cause certain resonant effects. If you're bombarded with these codes and formulas you don't consciously recognize or understand on a long-term basis, as done through consuming certain media prescriptions, you will eventually start thinking along the same lines on your own. This is why gematria is a form of lingual mind control. Again, one way or another. And they play a major role in the behavior modifications which can be effected in various methods via various triggers and formulas. 666 or 666 is the number of hive mind control, which, as stated above, is and has been one of the greatest tools to get the majority to accept things and attack naysayers, as is done every time the impressionable masses are redirected. And so again, the concept of the mass men from Pedagogy of the Oppressed comes to mind. And again, just the whole rats in the maze, or the city, the meaning of the city, and the labyrinth itself, the city as both labyrinth and computer circuit in a way, in the sense, again, with silent weapons and quiet wars, our consciousness and our physical and mental effort is all energy. Note that directions is 666, military's command code. 666, again, with this ant or hive mind, like the idea of the ants and beehive, it's all about signals. So again, signals from the sun, which we'll get into. 666 is the value of militaristic gematria itself. And in the past, it has been concealed in the formula of the swastika. Again, a solar magnetic sort of symbol. Yet another once positive symbol inverted and claiming millions of lives in its name, and at the hands of not one man but millions of brainwashed drones, or maybe I don't know how many exactly, but acting on the whim of another's will, not their own. But again, communism, all the other sort of genocidal bullshit. Also, the victims also wore the mark of the beast, as the Jews' hexagram also has the value of 666, a sort of, hexagram, mark of the beast or mark of Cain equivalent. Thus, we see why 666 was given as far back as a couple millennia ago as a number of prophetic omen. It is the supreme formula of the herd mentality gematria, the socialist psyche, and draconian politics. So again, it's like this dark, oppressive number, this sort of like demiurgic prison number, but it's also the soul itself. So it's the soul spark imprisoned, but asleep, and if it awakens, it can kind of be a little more fluid.
There were more surprises ahead. In the 1930s, another strange phenomenon was observed at even lower temperatures. This rapidly evaporating liquid helium cools until at 2 degrees above absolute zero, a dramatic transformation takes place.
Suddenly, you see that the bubbling stops and that the surface of the liquid helium is completely still. The temperature is actually being lowered even further now, but nothing particularly is happening. Well, this is really one of the great phenomenon in 20th century physics.
The liquid helium had turned into a superfluid which displays some really odd properties.
Here I have a beaker with an unglazed ceramic bottom of ultrafine porosity.
Ordinarily, this container with tiny pores can hold liquid helium. But the moment the helium turns superfluid, it leaks through.
We call this kind of flow a superflow.
Superfluid helium can do things we might have believed impossible. It appears to defy gravity. A thin film can climb walls and escape its container. This is because a superfluid has zero viscosity. It can even produce a frictionless fountain, one that never stops flowing. Superfluidity and superconductivity were baffling concepts for scientists. New radical theories were needed to explain them.
Which are only going to become worse problems unless we look at the psychological underpinnings of this data and consciously extricate ourselves from and be able to recognize these patterns and triggers. And again, subconscious patterns and routines and rituals and sort of Walking Dead zombie sort of bullshit. Patterns referring to the manifestation of a formula unconsciously, and triggers referring to the conscious placement of a formula. If you can learn and understand the number 666 and its logoic implications, you can understand politics and the control sequence of the growing neural technocracy currently being established through biometrics databases, geospatial satellite intelligence, quantum grid computing, brainwave analysis, tracking and surveillance of objects and populations, etc., all of which come together to form the same global brain computer which has been intuited and prophesied by people since before the internet or electricity was even invented. After all, these formulas and patterns have been bound up in the language itself since its inception, so they are not new, they're just latent formulas which have recently been recognized. I say they have been recently recognized, but that is just by me. It could be that various people throughout history have become aware of the Hebrew-English gematria formula as evidenced by the title of the United States government. But again, this may be unconscious patterning instead of a conscientious creation. Conversely, the idea of the United Nations and its role in globalization, in globalists is 666, and removing the sovereignty of nations is also bound up in the formula as a United Nation, which is also 666. This would be a great idea if it hadn't always been the first step in every tyrant's dream to rule the world. Now, such a feat will be engendered by way of a globalized military computer network which will dictate strategies in advance through the hierarchy of the hive. This is some practical and useful information I think everyone needs to be aware of, not the least of which being those who seek to effect change in the world for the better in any way they can, as few as though there may be. There is a situation brewing similar to that which was faced 100 years ago, and it will take much magic to counterbalance the materialistic and mundane drudgery the muddle-minded slaves have tried to foist in their inability to get off their hands and knees as infantiles and use the spines they were given. Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. And so, even though I put all this stuff down here, I want to actually talk about the Dragon Legacy, which there's so much about this book. And again, it's kind of controversial, I guess, and people don't like it in the reviews. But I find I think people are too quick to dismiss an entire book based on a few, points of conjecture or whatever. But Tracy Twyman said, I first heard of Nicholas de Vere on an internet chat group, typically an environment where people pretend to be something they are not, using their anonymity as an excuse to behave even more boorishly than they do in real life. On this chat group, we had recently been discussing the theories presented in Lawrence Gardner's book, Genesis of the Grail Kings. The list was suddenly flooded with emails declaring that Mr. Gardner's work was not to be trusted because he had once been involved with the unscrupulous Nicholas de Vere, or as one detractor called him, Tom Weir. The gist of the claim was that Mr. de Vere, who said he was a member of the Grail bloodline, the subject of the discussion list, had fabricated a royal genealogy, invented a royal magical order called the Dragon Court, which he bogusly declared to be ancient, and stood to make lots of money by selling admission to this order, as well as the sales of his book, From Transylvania to Tunbridge Wells, now called The Dragon Legacy, a book which, according to the emails, was utter nonsense and not worth reading. Being the individualistic type that I am, my natural inclination upon being told not to read something by self-serving know-it-alls is to seek it out immediately. This I did, easily locating Nicholas de Vere's book, which was, at that time, posted for free in its entirety on the Dragon Court website. Hardly the act of an unscrupulous con-man wishing to make big bucks off of a bogus claim. I printed out the entire thing and sat down on my bed to read, highlighter in hand to mark off anything important. A day and a half later, I had slept little, consumed lots of coffee, and was sitting in front of a manuscript half covered in pink highlighter. For the first time in my life, I had discovered another person who thought exactly the same way I did about the Grail and the Grail bloodline. Everything within the book corroborated the theories, speculations, and ideas that we had been writing about in a book of my own, many of them ideas I had held for a long time but never able to prove. Yet, here was a man claiming to speak for that very bloodline and ancient tradition which I had been studying and stating with assuredness what I had been hesitatingly proposing. De Vere painted a picture of the beginnings of the Grail bloodline in an antediluvian civilization with a superhuman red-haired race of Grail kings that conquered and ruled over the primitive hordes of the ancient world, with tribes on each continent. It provided the royal houses which guided the destiny of all civilized man. They were the overseers, navigators, directing the affairs of the world with the Solomonic wisdom inherent in their blood. They watched over a perfect, caste-ordered society in which all people worked and lived within their proper station, creating a harmonious, interdependent, and respectful relationship between the classes. They created all of the traditions, customs, and institutions upon which civilization depends, and of which our current traditions, customs, and institutions are pathetic bastardizations. In fact, I would assert that the dragon tradition has proven to be the very definition of tradition itself. As amazing as it was to find these ideas identical to my own in De Vere's unpublished manuscript, what was truly astounding were the more metaphysical aspects of the theory, again chillingly close to my own ideas. To De Vere, it is the blood itself which provides the basis for the divine right of dragons to be the overseers of society, and this is what sets them apart from the rest of humanity as gods are from mortals. This is the reason why, originally, they refused to mate outside of their race, and the reason why later they indulged in blood-drinking rituals in which the sacred Grail DNA could be consumed. But perhaps most amazing of all, De Vere states that Grail blood contains genes specifically programmed for magic. Dragons and only dragons can perform magic and are therefore only authentic witches, according to De Vere. For that reason, magic has always been an exclusive, secretive, royal art, and those outside of the bloodline attempting to perform such experiments are doomed to failure. We see these failures walking amongst us every day, and we can smell the mixture of self-pity and patchouli oil a mile away. This book lays down for the first time the scientific principles behind the effective use of ritual magic, and why some magicians are more effective than others. It explains the significance of the Grail bloodline, irrespective of modern pseudo-intellectual theories and religious doctrines. It reveals the true import behind age-old tales of vampires, elves, fairies, etc. It gives a reasonable explanation for the otherwise inexplicable course of man's history all the way back to the golden age of the gods, and man's fall from the grace of the natural state of affairs. It lays down the principles behind a fair and ordered society, something we once, during the golden age, took for granted. It sets the foundation for a true understanding of man's natural hierarchy and issues a death warrant for civilization should this fail to occur. De Vere writes from the perspective of a lone wolf, a man who fears neither death nor life, and lives for the purpose of being. He writes to satisfy his personal impulse towards self-expression, to put the truth as he sees it down on paper, not to convince anyone else. He is a self-contained entity. He needs nothing and no one outside of himself, yet he represents and defends the worldview of an entire race of men, or shall I say overmen, with whom he shares a genetic familial relationship. To him, that is the only human relationship that fully counts. that truly deserves the superior man's time, effort, and emotion. All else is puerile sentimentalism of the degenerate masses. Beyond his loyalty to his kinfolk, De Vere's true fidelity lies in the order of the universe and that transcendental principle which ordinary men know little of, but refer to blindly as God. De Vere is an iconoclast, an eccentric genius. He has all the qualities of the great writers and thinkers of history. In his philosophy, I put him on the same shelf as Julius Evola, or maybe next to Oswald Spengler. His historical perspective places his work among classics like Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, or L.A. Waddell's The Makers of Civilization in Race and History. His encyclopedic knowledge of occult traditions, their true meanings and origins, is superior perhaps to that of A.E. Waite, Manly Hall, or Israel Regardie. In the future, this book will be indispensable to all serious students of true occult tradition. Hecus, hecus, este babyloi. Begone, begone, ye profaners. It is safe to say that nothing is sacred in the writings of Nicholas de Vere, except that which is, by nature, sacred, because it pertains to that which is pure spirit. He does not reserve any pity for the sensitives of pathetic liberalisms, and makes mincemeat of modern pseudo-religions, the cult of children, the cult of the goddess, the cult of the oppressed, the cult of equality, and the cult of economy. Likewise, ritualistically slaughtered are the supposedly right-wing and conservative cults such as those of race, religion, and nationalism. This book is likely to anger people, namely, A. Liberals will not like this book because it declares to point out that not all men are created equal, nor are all men necessarily members of the same species. It shows that nature has assigned a caste system to various types of people, and that society works better when those castes are kept intact. People are happier when not forced, expected, or encouraged to live either above or below their natural station in life. B. Catholics will be upset by what De Vere has to say about their holy institution. They will also not be pleased with De Vere's lax attitude towards such contentious issues as incest, homosexuality, cannibalism, blood drinking, and human sacrifice. Jesus. It is well known in the advertising industry that any product or idea can be sold by implying that the children of the world will somehow benefit. This assertion is usually followed by the sickening catchphrase, "Children are the future," as if every sniveling rugrat were somehow paramount to the continuation of time. Jesus. In reality, the future may be found in only a fraction of a percent of those children, and feeding an out-of-control population of degenerates is not going to further any worthwhile goals. So again, there's kind of a radical sort of element, but see, New Age people will be upset to read from someone who clearly knows what he's talking about, that their incense, candles, and figurines are nothing more than a drain on their bank account. This bank account undoubtedly came with a personalized dragon-themed checkbook that says, "The goddess alive and magic is afoot." The reason for this is because the vast majority of these people are physiologically incapable of performing magic, according to De Vere. D. White supremacists will be upset because, as tempting as it will be for them to connect their cause to the dragon heritage, they won't be able to. De Vere describes the kinfolk which these people come from as slave races fit mostly for field labor. He also dismisses out of hand their precious fatherland idea and their pathetic nation worship. E. Finally, De Vere assures me that this work will be offensive to those upper-crust Englishmen and tinker nobility who still uphold the farce of Victorian values and artistic tastes. Being an American, I am not exposed to Victorian values very often, so I cannot comment on this matter any further. After a long sleep, the same theories reappear. Without doubt, they return richer and with new clothes. But the foundation remains the same, and the new mask which they wear should not mislead the man of knowledge. Le Serpent Rouge. De Vere's manifesto portrays a rather pessimistic attitude towards the idea of social progress, implying that the golden age of dragon hegemony is forever lost, never to return. This is something with which I do not agree. In fact, I can see De Vere's book playing a role of the revolutionary harbinger welcoming back a lost era. The word revolution implies revolving, returning in a circular pattern to the original starting point, like the labyrinthine spiral of history which Nick discusses later in this volume. All of the points in history, therefore, issue from and are based upon the unchanging center, that which is a priori, like the snake biting its tail, which the Dragon Court uses in its insignia. Or again, The Origins and History of Consciousness by Eric Newman, another book that's kind of hated but presents that sort of theory, I guess, of the Ouroboros in history. Nature has a way of correcting imbalances or of restoring elements to their rightful place, yet before that can happen, we must all be reminded of what the natural order actually is. Pseudo-intellectuals like to annoyingly quote the tired adage, "Those who forget history are condemned to repeat it." I say that unless we are reminded of the golden age of history, we will be unwilling, unmoved, and unable to replicate it in our modern era. This book is like a spell calling forth the forces that ruled thousands of years ago, calling them back to once again hold dominion over us. Within the pages of this volume, we, as dragons, and I consider myself among them, declare our intention to take back what is rightfully ours. If the powers of God and nature are on our side, how can we fail? Might is right is a popular motto amongst those who label themselves social Darwinists. While the principle holds true, a more proper way to express it would be to say that right is might. That is, if you are acting righteously in accord with what is right for you, attempting to take hold of the power that is rightfully yours, nature will equip you with the might necessary to accomplish the task, which is kind of a Crowleyan outlook. Materialism is the lie brought to the forefront by the mercantile class so loathed by Vere, which has caused the decay of society to its current level. People have wholeheartedly swallowed the assertion that money is power, outdone only by the equally offensive time is money. Even those who have attempted to rebel against materialism, such as the hippies of the 60s era or the communists of the 20th century, have always fallen into the materialist logic trap. They mistakenly believe that the problem of materialist elitism could be cured by redistributing the material wealth of rich people and preventing the accumulation of wealth, as if wealth itself were the problem, instead of the people who own it. Or, again, the victim mentality as well. And it's a cycle given of back and forth. But foolishly, they chanted slogans like, "There is no war but class war," and made statements like, "Every war in history was fought over money," when in fact almost every war can be traced back to a spiritual origin, or psychological, a conflict between deeply held beliefs, ideas, and cultural norms. It may be true that, as a general rule, those with true power use that power to acquire wealth, and those who are wealthy often use it to empower themselves, but the fact is that the two concepts, money and power, are two entirely different things. Money is a tool. It can be a reward for goods or services provided, a means of acquiring things that are needed, and a way of enabling projects to come to fruition. If it weren't for the fact that certain people have acquired large sums of money, nothing of any consequence would ever happen. No wars, no monuments, no research and development. But removed from the context in which it is being used, money is meaningless. It is a purely contingent phenomenon. Power, however, is something transcendental. Unlike money, it is not something that was invented by mankind as a means to an end. It issues directly from God and from nature herself. There is such a thing as power for power's sake, and power in the civic realm is based on sovereignty, which comes from the blood. Therefore, true power resides not in a person's bank account, but in their DNA. There it rests within most of us, potential energy waiting to be converted into kinetic energy through actual use. But most people are too weak of will, too lazy and unimaginative to make use of it. Even many people of the dragon blood have sunk into this abyss of uselessness. But the time for rest and relaxation is over now. We are charged with the responsibility of saving civilization, as the only people who are clear-sighted enough and capable of doing so. Cease to resist, the Beach Boys, paraphrasing Charles Manson. This book is part of a literary zeitgeist currently in manifestation that is destined to usher in a new era amongst the intelligentsia of the Western world. something I have termed the renaissance of the Arcadian mystique. Already much of the groundwork has been laid by the popular Lawrence Gardner books Genesis of the Grail Kings and Dragon Realms of the Ring Lords. These titles share much common ground with this book, The Dragon Legacy, which was completed in an early form back in 1997. But there is much work yet to be done. The job of writers, artists, and philosophers such as De Vere and I is not to bring about the political revolution which looms on the horizon. That is the job of the men of action who belong to our cause, the born leaders of the dragon blood who have been waiting and planning in the shadows for centuries, patiently plotting and manipulating in anticipation of the opportunity to act. They need no help in that regard. Rather, it is the job of the literary and artistic set to effect the intellectual revolution which must precede the political revolution. It is our job to clear the path ahead, to prepare the hearts and minds of the populace for what is to come, and to erase all fear, doubt, and resistance. We need not worry that the ideological climate is so seemingly hostile to values of blood, spirit, and hierarchy that we promote. The masses have no will of their own, beyond that which is given to them by those who assert themselves as their superiors. We live in a multinational culture that considers taking on new ideological system to be equivalent to putting on a t-shirt. They will attach themselves to any idea which is effectively marketed so as to take advantage of their frail psychology. The occurrences on the 11th of September 2001 proved that beyond question. Overnight, the American values of libertarian independence, personal freedom, an inherent right to privacy, and a healthy mistrust of authority gave way to state worship, rabid religious moralism, pithy sentimentality, and a general attitude of compliance towards whatever is necessary to keep us safe. All that was necessary to achieve the result was to push the right buttons. A blue light special in the marketplace of ideas. We have been told that our democratic society is a free marketplace of ideas. Since democracy is also capitalistic, it only makes sense that the marketplace of ideas embodies the same principles as our economy. The laws of supply and demand dictate what ideas are considered valuable, which beliefs are valid, and therefore which truths exist. By right of popularity, even the laws of physics can be accepted, rejected, or altered at will. But most ideas are cheap, worthless crap. Both the popularly held ideas and the majority of the rebellious counter-ideas presented by the numerous countercultures. Better that the intellectuals of today all dedicate themselves to promoting and exploring a single priceless transcendental idea. They can then find the best ways to defeat all competing inferior ideas rather than wasting their lives trying to come up with their own original, they dream, bad ideas, or worse yet, trying to promote a conglomerate of meaningless and contradictory herd ideas which they regard as worthy by right of their popularity. A book like this is meant to penetrate into the intellectual, educated class of society, sowing the seeds of draconian ideals on hopes that they fall on fertile ground, grow, and pollinate the popular culture a la trickle-down theory. It is then up to the intellectuals who have been won over to our side to solidify the ideological revolution in the popular mind. All that is truly necessary for this to occur, once the literate set has been fully indoctrinated, is an eye-catching symbol and a memorable slogan. Then the constant repetition of these two in conjunction until no one can remember a time when these ideas had not been accepted and understood. It is not necessary to argue, debate, or defend these ideas, but only to assert them as the absolute truths that they are. Wishy-washy discussion which considers the merits of opposing views merely invites attack and ridicule. However, truths spoken with authority and confidence have the mesmerizing effect upon the populace for which we are aiming. Once they are willing to accept, even demanding a transition back to the old true order and draconian traditional values, we can remove the tyrannies of democracy and capitalism, putting to bed once and for all this moronic concept of the marketplace of ideas. There is but one real idea, and we must hold true to it unswervingly. When we vacillate, when we stop to consider alternative ideas, we lose. We must surpass the intellect of the populace and aim at the soul. Gustave Le Bon wrote in The Crowd, "All founders of religious and political creeds have established them solely because they were successful in inspiring crowds with those fanatical sentiments which have as a result that men find their happiness in worship and obedience, and are willing to lay down their lives for their idols. This is the effect we are going for, and this monumental text put forth by Nicholas de Vere shall go a long way in promoting that cause. Thanks to him and others like him, although there truly are no others like him, the future of the dragon blood trembles with the awesomeness of its glorious potential. Our destiny awaits. Fraternally, Tracy R. Twyman. And so again, I think that's a little questionable, but it's also kind of interesting. I'm gonna have to go down to this chapter though. Well, I kind of want to go through some of the thoughts set forth in this, but while I'm thinking about it, something that kind of goes with this whole thing is what Robert Anton Wilson says about something called Operation Mindfuck.
Could you talk a little bit about an idea I've heard attributed to you called Operation Mindfuck? It sounds like a counter-propaganda technique similar to H.G. Wells' radio hoax.
Operation Mindfuck is a form of guerrilla ontology. It's a group effort involving many people, and it is an attempt to galvanize the minds of many readers and television viewers and moviegoers to suddenly see the world in a new way. And membership in Operation Mindfuck is not secret. It's just once you understand what Operation Mindfuck is, if you are a writer or a director or otherwise involved in the entertainment, literature, theater game, you just automatically become a member if you're sympathetic to it, and Operation Mindfuck rolls merrily along. And since it is no centralized conspiracy, nobody can ever stop it because there's nobody giving the orders. It's the only purely anarchist movement in the arts today. And it's very easy to recognize the members. You'll find 23s popping up in their works. You'll find references to the oncoming Yin Revolution, the Aquarian conspiracy, space travel, and there's an old Italian proverb: when four sit down to conspire, three of them are fools and the fourth is a government agent. And so I don't believe, and I believe with modern surveillance techniques, that's more true than ever. And any overt action against the power structure is doomed to failure because of the techniques of control that have been developed. But the anarchistic impulses of art cannot be governed. I think more and more of the culture shapers are becoming part of Operation Mindfuck, and the whole world is having its mind fucked. And I'm very happy that I can play a humble part in this noble endeavor.
All right, I know it's been a long time since, I don't know, it's been too fucking long, but it never fails. This time of year I get sick, and so I just had to wait it out. Okay. The Imperial and Royal Dragon Court of the Dragon Sovereignty, Sarkani Rend, 1408, Curia Regis et Ordo Draconis. The Imperial and Royal Dragon Court of the Dragon Sovereignty intends to continue to publish individual aspects of its history, along with references to the classical folklore and mythic customs of Europe and Asia, which are directly linked to the dragon tradition. We trust that readers of this work will find the given details sufficient to cement the facts pertaining to the dragon peoples, the dragon sovereignty, and its court. As defined within the main body of the following text, the Imperial and Royal Dragon Court represented herein, legitimately recognized as the sovereign court of the sovereign dragon nation by the relevant and appropriate government of a European member state, is a closed fraternity of individuals, representing those who trace their ancestry and affiliations back to the ancient Grail and dragon families. A closed fraternity. When the imperial and royal dragon court was reconstituted by King Sigismund in 1408 as the Societas Draconis, it was based upon an ancient bloodline tradition which Sigismund assumed that he had inherited from his presumed Egyptian and Scythian ancestors through the Pictish dragon princess Melasanu of Northumbria and the ancient and original Angevin royal house of Vere of Anjou, the imperial dukes of Angiers. This line had descended through the Tuatha De Danann, the dragon kings of Anu, on the one hand, and the Egyptian dragon dynasty of Sobek on the other. The latter strain includes the bloodline of the Davidic house of Judah, who married into the descent of the Merovingian kings of the Franks. Human vanities. Emperor Sigismund, as he was styled from 1410, was a son of the House of Luxembourg, dynasts who flagrantly altered their genealogy in order to be able to claim a fraudulent destiny from this dragon dynasty of Melasanu and Anjou. It is from this descent from Melasanu or Melusine, and upon her British, later Angiers Angevin, dragon court, that Sigismund claimed the right to base Societas Draconis as a bloodline continuation of this ancient, prehistoric, anti-Christian, pre-Catholic, British elven institution. One of the most famous members of Sigismund's misappropriated organization was Vlad Basarab, or Draculaea, the son of Vlad Dracul. After Draculaea's death, his son Michael wrote that his father proudly claimed a linear descent from the priests of the dragon court of Queen Sobek Nefru of Egypt, whose predecessor, Amenemhet, had built the dragon labyrinth of Fayum, dedicated to Sobek, which was later copied in Crete as the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. Dynastic deceptions. The genealogy of the House of Dracul, Dracula, or Basarab is well known and widely documented. Descending from Attila the Hun, this family was established in Central Europe by the sons of Genghis Khan. No bloodline with which the House of Basarab was associated or allied in marriage at that time had any affiliation with any extraction that was remotely related with the dynasties of Egypt. It is obvious, therefore, that Draculaea or Dracula must have been claiming an apostolic succession, a spiritual priestly lineage, deferring to the Egyptian dragon court of Sobek Nefru through Sigismund's assumed descent from Melusine. Her ancestry actually can be traced back to the Scythian dragon princess Skada, Queen Sobek Nefru, and the Egyptian cult of the dragon. Undoubtedly, Dracula assumed erroneously that he had received this ancient mystical honor during his investiture into Sigismund's Societas Draconis, and by virtue of Sigismund's supposed descent from Melusine and the ancient Angevin house of Vere. In his own right, Dracula can claim no relationship to any early Angevins, nor to the later Second Anjou house of Plantagenet, except via an 8-link marital bridge which has no alliances that relate him by blood to Anjou. Sigismund assumed a personal entitlement to this legacy in 1397, the date upon which he sought to reconstitute Princess Melusine's dragon court as Societas Draconis, in a manner that he deemed the most suitable to enhance his power base and establish his royal claims. Following its subsequent formal inception in 1408, the court recruited members from a number of prominent royal and noble houses. Historians have noted that these were not particularly known for their religious orthodoxy, including the later house of Vere in England, as one authority of Sigismund's dragon court has asserted. Today, however, the imperial and royal dragon court itself exists as a closed fraternity, a collective of individuals, comprising those who, unlike Sigismund, can trace their ancestry and affiliations back to the ancient, pre-Christian, elven, Grail, and dragon families via Anjou. The court retains the traditional 3-tiered degree system that Sigismund borrowed, into which he appended 3 separate representations of the alchemical Ouroboros emblem for the distinct ranks of the court. A 4th emblem, configured in the form of the Egyptian Ankh or Albigensian cross, was used by the family officers of the Inner Temple. The tripartite system was peculiar to the Scythians and Celts, whose druids incorporated a similar structure within their orders and colleges. It later found expression within the Cathar fraternity of Languedoc and also with the witches. It was developed within the hierarchical rule of the Knights Templar with whom the court had a strong historical connection. Blood relationship. The Inner Temple is presided over by the Vere Grand Masters, who are currently resident in Britain and Europe, being essentially an organization which emphasizes the crucial links between dragon families. The ranked system within the court takes second place to the sense of blood relationship and the natural bond of cooperation engendered by that relationship. Service, mutual support, and respect supersede those types of ambition and advancement which prevail in other bodies which might, on the face of it, resemble the Dragon Court model in some ways. Within such orders, sights are firmly set towards material gain through supporting establishments which themselves breed division and inequality. The tenets of the Grail and Dragon traditions are implicit in defining that we should be at one with the earth and cannot, therefore, presume dominion over it, unlike those who wish to profit unjustly from dubious Merovingian descent. This philosophy is embedded in the concept of individual gnosis and lies at the very heart of the Draconian culture. It is evident in all aspects of life itself. Emanating from the ancient lore of the elven lords and ladies of the forest, this ancestral legacy forms the bedrock upon which this and all legitimately related dragon courts were originally founded. The Tinker Kings. It is no secret that, through a process of calculated indoctrination, our individual decisions are often prompted by fears of nonconformity or insecurity. As a result, we are conditioned to purchase a variety of hyped goods and services in order to redress personal inadequacies that do not, in fact, exist. In reality, the prevalent forms of fear-based merchandising are little different from straightforward protection rackets, and yet they are sanctioned and encouraged by our governing establishments. For centuries, Western state authorities and their churches have enjoyed continued power over a subordinate majority by presenting a facade of sacrosanct jurisdiction which has seemed inextricably linked to some form of royalty, nobility, or government by divine sanction. By virtue of this, it is not surprising that so many people now consider royalty, nobility, and Western religion to be archaic components of a system of class and privilege which has no place in the modern age. What few recognize, however, is that for centuries, the perceived representation of royalty and nobility has, to a large extent, been a fraud perpetuated by a dressed-up merchant-class elite who have no real entitlement to their positions. This farce, with its inherent tyranny and social abuse, has been endured through the ages, while the true bloodline families have been suppressed and supplanted by traders and brokers disguised in crowns and mitres. In practice, there is nothing noble about these Tinker Kings, since the word noble relates to gnosis or wisdom. However, they have long been defined as aristocrats, meaning best rulers, and have thereby retained gratuitous stations of power and influence in a self-proclaimed higher echelon of society. These Tinker Kings and their emissaries have plagued the Western scene for generations, leaving all to wonder how it is that our supposed guardians and ambassadors are so often an embarrassment and are rarely representative of community requirement. They refer to all and sundry as subjects, commoners, and flocks, using such patronizing terminology as the ordinary people or the man in the street, as if they had some predestined right of supremacy. In reality, the fact is that the individual establishments of these said aristocrats, be they state heads, provincial overlords, or clerical governors, are frequently very questionable, and their personal roots are often more ordinary than most. Prior to these distortions, the nature of kingship was entirely different. There was no requirement for church sanction through coronation by parvenu popes or archbishops. Kingship was founded upon the ideal that all people were adherents of the earth, that the earth bestowed sovereignty upon its firstborn people, the elven tribes. They were represented by a dragon queen, and she empowered the Grail King, who could not be a king without her. In this environment, the right to kingship emanated from the female, since Mother Earth was herself deemed to be female. The overriding function of a king and queen was to maintain a spiritually transcendent intelligence within the realm, thereby enabling the organism, the kingdom, to function and develop in symbiosis with its surrounding environment. If a chance of governmental practice is deemed necessary, then there is nothing to gain by swapping the merchant-class nobles for lawyer-class presidents. There is, however, much to be gained by considering the advantages of properly defined Grail kingship in the messianic code of princely service within a socially orientated constitutional framework. This is the most logical route towards ensuring that true democracy prevails for democracy and is correctly defined as government for the people by the people, as opposed to the all too familiar and oppressive government of the people. Opportunists and orators. As a result of general disenchantment, many now suggest that royalty and nobility should be marginalized in favor of republican-style government. Some determine that such changes replace privilege with a more acceptable form of merit advantage. However, this perception is equally untenable in practice. All that happens is that headstrong merchant-class opportunists are replaced by polished lawyer-class orators, thereby creating an unwarranted new elite with the same destructive hold on society. Government of the majority by an exclusive clique which uses intimidating tactics to manipulate a consumer-based economy has nothing whatever to do with the time-honored spirit of Grail kingship and the dragon blood. Any shift from a monarchy to republicanism is simply a matter of different packaging. In the event, we are still captive consumers enveloped within faiths of fear. Our legacy from all this is an inbred contempt for anything which does not conform to a system of venerated sale values. This leads to the loss of our relationship with the ecosphere upon which all species truly depend. And so again, all this is kind of complicated, I guess, but I think it's worth considering because aside from, again, some of the radical takes that I guess just seem kind of contradictory in some ways, I see what he's saying in a lot of ways about having a better society that works in unison with natural principles and whatnot, rather than exploiting everything for not even really much gain at all for anybody. But anyway, the Grail, the practical application of the Grail code of service and guardianship was geared to the Hermetic principle as above, so below. It recognized that no sane mind would, for the sake of short-term profit, disenfranchise the body upon which it depends. From medieval times, however, this is precisely what has happened, with the church installing dealers and merchants as puppet kings, traders, who had no knowledge of kingship, but who have spawned dynasties which in turn have appointed their own colleagues as hereditary puppet nobles. The church and its appointees, be they monarchs, bishops, or pseudo-nobles, have proclaimed the messianic legacy to be heresy. By doing this, they have underwritten and promulgated tyrannical systems of elitism, separatism, and environmental domination to the detriment of the many. Out of Egypt. The Dragon Court can first be identified in Egypt under the patronage of the priest Prince Ankh-Nakhonsu in about 2170 BC. It was subsequently established more formally as a pharaonic institution by the 12th dynasty Queen Sobek Nefru, c. circa 1785 BC. The court pursued the teachings of Thoth, which had prevailed from the time of Nimrod's grandson, King Raneb, a pharaoh of the second dynasty. He reigned circa 2852 BC, about 3 centuries before the Giza pyramids are considered to have been built. In those far-off times, the priests and temples were not associated with religion as were their later successors in other lands, but rather more with the duties of preserving and teaching the old wisdom. The temples incorporated alchemy workshops. It was the obligation of the priests to maintain the spiritual welfare of the pharaohs, while ensuring the purity of a continuing royal bloodline which progressed through the dragon queens of the matrilinear Grail succession. Dragon sovereignty had evolved in Egypt from old Mesopotamia, and its tradition was vested in Sobek, the sacred crocodile, or the Messe or Mooshus. It was from the practice of kingly anointing with the fat of the Messe that the Hebrew verb Mashiach, or to anoint, derived. And the dragon dynasts became known as messiahs or anointed ones. In 525 BC, Egypt was conquered by the Persians, whose kings were subsequently ousted by Alexander the Great's Macedonian army in 332 BC. This led to the Greek dynasty of the Ptolemies and the well-known Queen Cleopatra VII. Her liaison with the Roman general Mark Antony caused the final downfall of the pharaohs, and Egypt was subjugated by imperial Rome shortly before the time of Jesus. At length, as the Roman Empire collapsed, Egypt fell to Byzantine governors, and then, after AD 641, to the sway of Islam. By that time, the Grail dynasty from David and Solomon had progressed into the west, notably to the Merovingian kings of Gaul, while related branches established kingdoms in Ireland and Celtic Britain. These lines were linked through marriage to parallel dragon strains from Ham, Japhet, and Tubal-Cain, which had survived as the royal houses of Scythia and Anatolia. The families had forged their own marital links with the early princesses of the Egyptian succession. The first pendragon, or head dragon, of the Britannic Isle, Pen Draco Insularis. From this stock was King Cymbeline of the House of Camus, who was installed in about AD 10. The Celtic pendragons were not father to son successors in a particular descent, but were individually elected from reigning family branches by a druidic council of elders to be the overall kings of kings. The last pendragon was Cadwallader of Gwynedd, who died in AD 664. At around that time, much of Britain fell to the Germanic influence of the invading Anglo-Saxons, and Anglo-land England was born, as distinct from Scotland and Wales. This coincided with Byzantium's loss of Egypt to the caliphs, and following the last Roman emperor in AD 476, a completely new governmental structure evolved in the West. Its ultimate overlords were the popes, and outside of the preserved Celtic domains, they appointed kings not by any right of heritage, but to suit the political motives of the bishops and the fast-growing Roman Church. It appeared that the days of the dragon heritage were over. However, the true dynasts of the original Grail stock always upheld their positions, and the spirit of the dragon court continued in influential circles throughout Europe and the Near East. The Dragon and the Grail. As the generations passed, the ideal of dynastic kingships spread through the Mediterranean lands into the Balkans, the Black Sea regions, and Europe. But in the course of this, the crucial essence of the old wisdom was lost, and this gave rise to dynasties that were not of the true kingly race. Instead, many were unrelated warrior chiefs who gained their thrones by might of the sword. The sacred culture of the ancients was, nevertheless, retained in the messianic line of King David of Judah, circa 1008 BC, whose significance was not in his generally portrayed descent from Abraham in the Shemite strain, but in his pharaonic heritage. It was through this particular dragon inheritance that Solomon the Wise, some 8 centuries after Queen Sobek Nefru, was enabled to recreate the royal temple project in Jerusalem. This led to a Holy Land revival of the pharaonic Rosicrucius, or Dew Cup, movement at a time when Egypt was beset by foreign influences, first from Libya, Nubia, and Kush, and then from further afield. As a result, the traditional marriage arrangements of the pharaohs and princesses gave way to diplomatic alliances. The symbol of the Rosicrucius, or Rose Cross, had identified the Grail succession from beyond 3000 BC, and its graphic representation was a red cross within a circle. Societas Draconis. In 1408, when Britain was in her Plantagenet era, the Dragon Court was formally reconstituted as a sovereign body at a time of wars and general political turmoil. As we have seen, the court's dubious re-emergence was instigated by Sigismund von Luxemburg, King of Hungary. Having presumptuously and erroneously assumed to have inherited the bloodline legacy in 1397, he drew up a pact with 23 royals and nobles who swore to observe true and pure fraternity within the Societas Draconis, a style subsequently misidentified as the Ordo Draconis, Hungarian Sarkany Rend. Although the original court was by no means an order in the recognized chivalric sense, the misnomer was strategically retained for the purposes of identification. Along with Sigismund and the 23 nobles, Sigismund's second wife, Barbara Sill, daughter of the Austrian Duke Hermann of Styria, was joint sovereign. Barbara was a vampire who was taught by Ibrahim Eleazar, the keeper of the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage, and it is she who is the model for the beautiful Countess Carmilla Karnstein in Le Fanu's novel of the same name. Sigismund's daughter Elizabeth was also a member of the court, and the inclusion of the entire family thereby achieved the traditional overall standard of 26 members, or 2 magical circles of 13. Others prominent in the Societas Draconis were the kings of Poland and Aragon, the Duke of Lithuania, and the unrepentant heretic, the Duke of Split. The founding document of the court confirmed that members might wear the insignia of a dragon incurved into a circle with a red cross, the original emblem of the Rosa Crucis, which had identified the Grail succession from before 3000 BC. Members were required to wear black attire on Friday, the day ruled by Venus, and to all intents and purposes they were to hold property in common. The society had no patron saint, it had no chapel or chapter house, and observed no feast or holy days. Members were expected to have been ennobled prior to entry, and were only elevated within the society in recognition of their contributions to the welfare of the crown. Sigismund never knighted anyone into the society. This ignored completely all the expected rituals and affectations of chivalry prevalent at the time. At least the Luxemburgundian got that right. Imperial status. Shortly after this foundation, Sigismund was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, and as a result, the noble fraternity achieved a heightened status as an imperial edifice. Although the court's ancient origins were steeped in pre-Christian lore, Pope Eugene IV was obliged to approve his emperor's non-Catholic establishment, for the nature of the dragon, even if you fake it, is such that its kingly tradition surmounts the mundane constraints of denominational dispute. After all, King David, Solomon, and even Jesus were all pre-Christian dynasts of the line. There were, of course, those staunch upholders of the Church's Articles of Dogma who openly opposed the pre-papal concept of real kingship. These bishops pronounced the Arthurian romances heretical and blacklisted the writings of Merlin in 1546 at the Council of Trento in northern Italy. Everything that was magic to the ears and all that was fresh air to the subjugated became denounced as sinister and occult. The great enlightenment of the Grail Code of service was condemned in a series of brutal inquisitions from 1203, and anything remotely connected with the female draconian ethic was justifiably dubbed witchcraft. The following series of essays, which could be alternatively titled The History of the Dragon Peoples, are extracted from archival and research material. The author derives its contemporary synthesis from a 30 to 40 year period of scholarship, teaching, revelation, and ceremony. The following collection of studies reflects the nature of the author's final conclusions in 1993 and at the time of publication in 2004, respectively. This is the first book in a series of works covering the history of the elven tribes in the dragon tradition. Further works, due to be published here shortly, will conclude archaeological and historical studies of the Derkesthai culture from 10,000 BC onwards. Further material from the Dragon Archives, an ongoing series of novels and a series of scientific papers. The ethos of the dragon culture encourages an intelligent, but above all, a ruthlessly honest appreciation of the matters presented. We hope that this may expose the establishment's historical fabrications and deceptions throughout history, which have harmed society immeasurably. We want to change the attitudes of the many who have been manipulated for the gain of a few for over 1,000 years. Although it may appear elitist, when the old families observe that the dragons are being misrepresented to the extent that everybody wants to become one, the time-honored consensus of feeling among them is compounded. They see that it inevitably leads to a gap in the market being filled, resulting in yet another impotent impertinence being perpetrated. A good example of this is the detritus of Gerald Gardner, which he presented in the 1950s as the definitive and original expression of the old religion. Inauthentic witchcraft emerged in the 1950s, principally at the instigation of this retired clerk in the Indian Raj named Gerald Gardner. It is from this particular source that the ridiculous notion of witchcraft being primarily a fertility cult gained its credence. He sanitized what little he knew about witches with exactly the same pecuniary, sexual, or social motives that his descendants used for peddling their equally useless rubbish today. One can't initiate into the old blood or teach the old ways to the Malhum. It is a pointless and fruitless waste of time that doesn't work. They inevitably get the wrong idea and discard its most valuable tenets. Alternatively, they add to that history or knowledge their own misconceptions, which then become carved in stone and published in faddist popular books as the sacred wisdom of a faddist culture. Naturally, it would be appreciated if people identified sympathetically with the characters in the dragon tradition, but not to the extent where every reader thinks they are one, or can aspire to be one. Most of them could never be. The courses of initiations which are on offer from the exploiters of the New Age money machine are sanitized to obliterate what could be termed a dark and hence possibly evil tradition. Such exercises will also inevitably lead to the discredit of the dragon ethos. When such courses or initiations are found not to work, it is because the majority of participants either won't have the right blood serum or the right connections in their cerebral lobes. We live in a world in which all people are encouraged to think of themselves, somewhat hypocritically given the way they treat each other, in homogeneous, egalitarian terms. Therefore, the foregoing statement is tantamount to heresy. It is unacceptable in ordinary society to suggest that people are not equal, or physiologically and anatomically the same, but nevertheless they are not. One might counter such an unreasonably deluded and elitist-sounding statement by arguing that because of the outbreeding of the old families, there must be millions of people of the fairy blood living today. However, such a statement flies in the face of the following accepted historical facts. A. The genuine old royal families rarely outbred at all, whilst the latter, fake parvenu tinker nobility with whom people now confuse them, often did. B. Most of the Scythian royal druidic fairy population in Britain and Europe was wiped out by the Romans in the battles at Mona and other druidic sites. C. The Celts, and what was left of the Scythian fairy families who served as their lords and protectors, were decimated by bubonic plague, starvation, and the Saxon invasions in the 6th century. Following this, in Britain and continental Eurasia, the Church and the rats spent another 300 or 400 years during the medieval and Reformation periods dispatching the survivors of the previous epidemics, famines, wars, or persecutions. And D. That the Aryan Scythian overlords, the fairy high kings and queens, maintained a caste system that, although eventually became corrupt and overrun by the warrior caste, was arguably still in place as the European class system until the Second World War. Even up until the First World War, the manorial restrictions of the movements of rural laborers, other than during holidays, were still enforced and thus unhindered mobility, either geographically or within the class system itself, was extremely rare. Throughout the period preceding the modification of the witchcraft laws, now called the Fraudulent Mediums Act, the remnant of the Scythian sacral royal overlords who were left were destroyed by papal decree. In the meantime, in Britain, in addition to the persecutions, many of the wealthier and more powerful overlords whose families had survived up to that point were killed off and or replaced in both lands and name by those merchant-class New Tinker families. They, in turn, paid the corrupt ersatz royalty of the Tudor and Stuart houses enough money for the titles and estates. Following this sequence of events, Oliver Cromwell continued the good work and massacred the nobility and allowed their estates to be usurped by even more members of the merchant class. Considering the sum of this state of affairs, it is extremely unlikely that any of the people in those classes whose descendants now patronize the New Age fads would have made contact with or intermarried with what was left of the pure elven blood royale. Therefore, to say perhaps that it doesn't matter whether a few mercenary fly-by-nights open up preposterous courses, making ludicrous false claims to be able to train and initiate probationary elves or Grail maidens, is a denial of what the fairy blood and the teachings are all about. The descent and the doctrine of the elven fairies are based upon truth and honor. The comparison shows in sharp relief to what extent people today have already been betrayed enough over the centuries by their own kind. And real quick, I know the whole fairy, a lot of this, the witches and all this stuff sounds LARPy and kind of just laughable. But if whenever I study Native American cultures and Tibetan and Southeast Asia, like, to me, the fact that they were kind of like, to some degree, I mean, it's debatable, but somewhat working with nature and stuff, and with a reverence of nature at least, rather than a sort of, again, an exploitative dominion sort of mindset. To me, that is like witchy, like it's very magical in a way, or it's like when you study the fairy faith in the Celtic countries and that whole mythology, sort of that fairy outlook, I guess. I don't know. It's just something that kind of, it's like that whole idea of the archaic revival that Terence McKenna talks about, which I don't necessarily think we have to all like throw away technology again, To reiterate, I don't think we need to like completely throw away and ignore the benefits of technology and science and certain medical advancements. But at the same time, like we have to kind of look both ways, forward and backward, the whole Janus concept that Koestler talks about. If one represents people with the dragon history in an over-attractive, candy-sweet wrapping, or in such a manner as to make it seem as if anyone can belong to it, then one becomes a deceiver oneself. This would lay others open to psychological abuse, financial exploitation, and manipulation at the hands of the New Age money vampires, thereby adding yet another element to the mass psychological ignorance and confusion over identity that already contributes to such social disquiet and unrest. Unscrupulous advertising executives, politicians, and manufacturers lead people to believe that they can be whoever they want to be and achieve anything they want to achieve. The only conditions are that they have enough money and work hard enough for the establishment's corporate elites. The object is to produce more efficient consumer producers. Class barriers have been relaxed only slightly for a couple of generations. It is likely that the vast majority of those who like to prop up their egos and empower themselves, in a world that only encourages such in the financial sense, by becoming elven magicians, grail maidens, or vampire overlords, are going to be in for a big disappointment. It's no use saying that people don't think like that, because they do. Literally thousands of people in Britain and America have the impudence to call themselves witches. Hundreds more join magical orders or associations. Thousands more sign up for mystical New Age workshops in a plethora of inappropriate foreign disciplines unsuited to their cultural backgrounds. It can be guaranteed that none of them were ever asked about their family history, which, after all, from an endocrinal point of view, is the most important criterion. And so again, I know some of what this guy's saying sounds like racist, I guess, to the modern fucking mind. Like, even to me, I know that's why I say it's like radical. It's almost like racist in a way, but it's not, I don't think. I think what he's saying is that we should just be true to ourselves, be true to our origins, historically. And even if it sounds, weird to us, where, in this sort of like open borders sort of world, I think even geographically, people have a relationship with, where they're originally from. And as I'm not saying everyone needs to stay where they're fucking from, but I think there's a connection there that we, in our materialistic, again, like United Nations sort of influenced thinking, we're not sort of realizing, like, there's like, again, Terence McKenna comes to mind. He talks about how our diet and our relationship with the local plants, ethnobotany and all that, has a psychological effect and therefore a social effect. And so I just think we need to consider that more. I mean, it's really not that crazy to think. It's just, I guess, it's a lot being said to get to that point. Literally thousands of people. So people don't realize that they have only just emerged from a social system which was corruptly used by the church state for centuries to engineer them into having specific brain physiologies which are not suitable for application to dragon subjects. If they were, then the majority of people would have transcended naturally by now anyway, and the world would be an entirely different place. And so, yeah, I always wonder, like, what sets some people apart from others? And it's got to be a little more than just nurture, there's got to be some inherent, some people are just geared for some subjects and things, and, like, I don't know. They haven't, they can't, it isn't, and under the present circumstances, it never will be. Even if society were to interbreed more with the dragon families that are left, if there are any at all, then the dragon DNA would eventually become weaker. In this case, the dragon ability would then be lost, leaving us with exactly the same social result anyway. The modern idea that potentially anyone can be initiated either as a witch or a druid is pretentious and arrogant. It has been, it is said, in privately circulated witchcraft documents, a source of offense to many ancient families for over half a century. Unless a full, genuine, known pedigree can be produced, demonstrating an unbroken line of descent from a royal, arch-druidic family, no modern aspirant or so-called priest or priestess has the right either to call themselves a witch or a druid. The same applies to those who would call themselves Aryans. The modern concept of initiation into witchcraft is an insult to those whose families, over the period of the 1,000-year elven holocaust, died at the hands of the church. Like elven royalty and nobility, to which druidism and witchcraft are inextricably linked, both are aspects of the high Aryan mana, the mystical Maja or Maya, the genetic memory of a unique race that is carried in the blood. This cannot be bestowed by any form of nonsensical neo-pagan nonsense. So it's kind of redundant, but the Royal Windsor Coven and many others reputedly old hereditary family groups were the custodians of tradition which had, by their own admission, little or nothing in common with the modern neo-pagan revivalist movement or its reconstructed rituals. The latter had been invented by Gerald Gardner and revised by Sanders and other initiates. These gentlemen, the Marshmallow Papers related, were, along with Crowley, rebuffed by Pickingill or other covens that descended from those East Anglican septs which themselves descended from either the historical British covens or the Flemish weavers. Hence, it must be noted that Aleister Crowley was actually interested in witchcraft. Isn't that a surprise? Considering the fact that his generation of magicians usually tended to repudiate it, or did they? Undoubtedly, many magicians have justifiably poured scorn on modern Wicca, but nevertheless, it still remains a recorded fact that Crowley attempted to join George Pickingill's group. And says, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a series of privately published papers were circulated which contained material that originated from old Northern covens and the Royal Windsor Coven. One in particular, the Marshmallow Papers, contained a damning criticism of so-called Gardnerian and Alexandrian initiatory witchcraft. This was followed by criticisms made to this author that stemmed from the leaders of the Baphometic orders in London in the Black Country, who emphatically asserted that the only genuine form of valid witchcraft was passed down through the blood. Furthermore, one of Crowley's close associates, Austin Osman Spare, was involved in witchcraft himself. We can perhaps see from Spare's work, The Anathema of Zos, why Crowley was so interested in Pickingill's pre-revivalist doctrine of the craft of the wise. In Spare's essay on traditional witchcraft, or at least by his time, a late corrupted form of it, he describes as an ecstatic transcendent philosophy. He was familiar with and variously employed the strategies anciently used in so-called high magic to encourage the body to transport itself into states that were old territory for the Magi and the Druids, the Maenads and the Bacchantes. Spare's account clearly demonstrates that witchcraft had tantric elements and was, like Crowley's system of magic, in the business of making ubaids or overseers. This is poles apart from Gerald Gardner's media-friendly product of modern Wicca. In examining Spare's work, we might learn why Crowley was so interested in Pickingill, and then be tempted to ask where the Africans got voodoo, as it is known to us. New Age paganism, or Wicca, repackages old hypocritical Christian moral values and symbols and attaches products, services, and books of no value whatsoever. These are promoted and marketed by business people whose only interest is in building up a captive client base of weak-minded individuals who are programmed to buy the next soul-saving product from them. Soon, les idiots dans le quest pour la vérité discover that the last philosophical tin of beans or cheap crystal they bought from the high gurus of the New Age does not work. Then these peddlers of kitsch truth tell them that their karma is wrong, or they don't believe it enough, or that they have a hostile attitude, or lack of focus, or some such excuse. This deflects the blame from them and lays it firmly at the door of the luckless punter, following which they then recommend that the sap buy one of these irreproachable wise ones, yet another mystery of the ancients at only $29.99, which will undoubtedly work this time. And it never does, and so they go back for another try. Real magic is at work here. A group of secretly initiated individuals are turning dross into gold. Fools give charlatans good money in exchange for utterly useless rubbish. Now that's alchemy. The papers originating from the Northern Covens clearly revealed that witchcraft prior to the Wiccan revival of the 1950s bore no resemblance to what passes for formulaic witchcraft now, and was not pagan, fertility-based, or necessarily goddess-led. Essentially, it was and is the same as the witchcraft sponsored by the Baphometic orders who trace their lineage back through the Templars to Jesus' original teachings in the culture of the Druids. The nearest approximation or identification in this particular instance would be between the late 19th century Northern British ritual and the French medieval Cathar-sponsored witch movement. In both these instances, the central figure was Baphomet, and the highest sacrament of the Sabbat was the Black Mass. This had nothing to do with Satanism, which in itself was and is a late, half-understood non sequitur manufactured by the Roman Church, that has nothing to do with the dragon tradition. Many so-called aficionados of the occult, and especially those who like to call themselves witches in public, maintain that the Black Mass was satanic. They go on to say that white witchcraft, or wickycraft, as they like to call it, has nothing to do with Satanism and the Black Mass, which are a parody of Catholicism and the Catholic Mass. They squawk, off-pat and by rote, like trained parrots, while the Church Fathers grin gleefully that they see how well their propaganda has taken root. The Wiccans, or Neo-Pagans' agenda here is to try and convince as many people as they can that they are mysterious and somehow superior to others without actually saying as much. They themselves think, and would like other people to think, that they belong to an ancient tradition or fraternity with knowledge to which the public isn't party. They want to impress upon people further, before those people are tempted to start throwing big bricks through witchy windows, that witches are really nice people, and that true Wiccans, whilst still trading off the dark and slightly dangerous allure evoked by the word witch, deal solely with white magic. In this way, the attention seekers hope to become more popular or respected by being surrounded by some aura of mystique that they consider, in their own minds, to be cool. They've seen witches on television, no doubt. They believe that by jumping on the bandwagon and choosing the particular persona out of the many that are on offer at a price, it will make people think they are special and hence attractive. The big stumbling block here is that royal witchcraft, or witchcraft proper, from the early Dark Ages onward, owes as much to its clearly Christian as it does to its direct Druidic origins. Both in their original form, in the publicly disseminated opinion of the Catholic popes, were and are satanic. Jesus' hereditary and the descent of the Druidic dynasties both derived from an identical dragon nascence that the Roman Catholics decided was devilish, because the descent of both bloodlines was from the Sumerian Enki, who was the Akkadian Samael, the Roman Lucifer, and thus the Catholic Satan. In Jesus' case, the Roman Church, as do all outsiders who know they are onto a good thing, sanitized his rituals and concealed his descent. All those who continued to follow Jesus' original teachings, like the witches, they burned as heretics. This notwithstanding, the Wiccan apologists still try to tell us that witchcraft has nothing to do with Christianity, but is a pre-Christian fertility religion. However, the word heretic was only used by the Inquisitors to specifically define those heterodox Christian beliefs which were at variance with the Roman Church's orthodox teachings. To call a witch a heretic meant that the witch was a heterodox Christian. The Inquisitors, whatever we may think of them, were nobody's fools. They were aware of whom they were targeting. They also knew that witches were original Christians whose knowledge of the true Druidic nature of Jesus' liberating Christianity had to be quashed at any cost if the Church were to achieve the political and pecuniary supremacy they desired by replacing it with their own enslaving dogma. All the time witches existed, they were a testament to the fact that Roman Catholicism was nothing like Christianity, and was nothing more than a pack of usurping lies made fragrant with the incense of the suffering of the dragons, whom the Roman Church had murdered in their pursuit of ultimate world power. The author has had first-hand experience of what happens when outsiders, either as media commentators or as supporters, become involved with the traditions of the old families. It doesn't take long before both types start to demand that the tradition be adjusted to meet the middle-class expectations of a purchasing public that has been fed on sanitized, smug, New Age moral crapulence. This is so that they, either the commentators or supporters, can attract even more adherents or readers and thereby increase their envisaged profit margins. After a while, in order to ensure maximum profits, the outsiders set about trying to silence and marginalize the very people who were born into that tradition and upon whom they formerly depended for their wisdom and knowledge. This is just in case the now somewhat bemused custodians of the blood do something out of keeping with what we are trying to achieve. As Mr. Kenneth Grant, OTO, has pointed out, money and magic don't mix. The author echoes this statement when he states emphatically that the Dragon Court is a closed body which is kept sacrosanct for members of the blood, and it is not a public profit-making organization. As for the Black Mass that so-called New Age Wiccans disown, this ritual was not a Christian parody born of frustration with or rebellion against the Church of the day, as they repeat faithfully from the formulae printed in their bite-sized tomes of New Age dogma. It was the original Christian Mass of Jesus, which the Catholics later stole and sanitized for public consumption, in the same way that Wiccan apologists are doing with witchcraft today. Anyone with average intelligence can interpret the Black Mass properly. Prior to the attaching of the Church's satanic label during the medieval period, and its decadence and misuse by outsiders throughout the Renaissance and post-Reformation eras, it was one of the most profound and poetic family rituals ever conceived. Its hermetic and alchemical symbolism delved deep into the Kabbalah and high magic. If so-called Wiccans in fact actually were real witches, they would know this. But they don't, and they're not. The hyperbole that they indulge in is no more than a regurgitation of books written by equally misinformed writers who, over the preceding decades, have managed to get their seriously flawed ideas published. Whether perceived from the point of view of either its Christian or its Druidic aspects, royal witchcraft was never devotional. So much for witchcraft being a fertility religion. The Black Mass has its roots in the ancient alchemical lore of Solomon, and was simply a memento of teachings long past, and an aide-memoire for future generations, a mnemonic which was intended to remind those to come from whence the power and wisdom derives. If the reader looks carefully at the Adzilith scales of the Sephiroth of Binah, we will see what is meant. The sabbatic goat of the Black Mass was Chem Zoroaster, one of the early ancestors of the ancient dragon families. His symbolic presence at the Mass reminds one that the royal witchcraft was strictly a family affair. Witches actually called their god the antecessor, meaning the ancestor. This illustrated to later generations of readers that Satan, also called by witches Christ son de, or Jesus Christ, Son of God, and was in fact a flesh and blood being. He was not a fallen angel invented by commercially minded Catholic priests. If the witches of the royal covens honored Jesus as an ancestor god, then they must have been Merovingian by descent and thus custodians of the Sang Royal. Here we enter in upon the realm of the Holy Grail. Royal witches were elven by blood, and everybody contemporary to them knew this. Professor Margaret Murray made this assertion in England and was followed by Jules Michelet in France, who recorded that the epithet fairy was attributed by the French to the ancient Gallic queens. This also meant that the Holy Grail itself was elven, as was Jesus himself, complete with his crown of fairy thorns, depicted as the headgear of Godefroy de Vere de Bouillon in the 12th century. Throughout the generations, ignorant outsiders have distorted the history of the ancient families and the ancient royal doctrine. The fact that most of humanity is engaged in activities based upon greed and which are destroying their world is actually seen to be good. Those who disagree with first, this modus operandi, and second, hold an historically different perspective and are perceived as evil. New Age Wicca members perpetuate this logical imbalance for their own nefarious, selfish ends. They have nothing to do with witchcraft, but everything to do with the selfish motivation of those who promote a white Wicca for their own financial, social, or sexual ends within a social environment which is still morally conditioned by manipulative medieval prejudices. Modern Wicca, much like other aspects of the 21st century, is a cheap imitation of what has gone before. Thus, it is little more than a fashion statement for those who want to take part in the born-again Christianity. These views are due not to any particular bad experience with Wiccans or New Agers, other, that is, than any experience with such people is likely to be negative. It is simply the conclusion reached after 30 years of active involvement in the dragon tradition. This has shown again and again that those who are attracted to the manufactured trappings of the so-called New Age and Wicca are social inadequates providing perfect bait for unscrupulous charlatans. The British Trading Standards Office demands of the manufacturer or service provider that any goods or services offered for sale by them should be fit to be used for the purpose for which they were intended. The New Age movement, Wicca, and indeed modern revivalist Christianity all fall below this definition and furthermore, and therefore, technically fall foul of the British Trades Descriptions Act. All, including revivalist Christianity, should be investigated in these terms and also in relation to the British Fraudulent Mediums Act. They will not because they make money. As far as the security services are concerned, they are impotent and harmless. Besides, they keep the consumers quiet in their semi-detached cages. To the sociologists who advise governments, we have become categorized into numbered social units. To those governments' military tacticians, we are expendable civilian collateral assets. And to the tradesmen who control those governments, we are consumers. Do we wish to continue to be labeled so cynically and only according to our relative value to any given elite or its agents? The inverted pyramid of diminishing human value. Expendable civilian collateral asset. Numbered social unit. The consumer. Pawn. 0. If the planet is to survive, social groups must become smaller and ordered by economic necessity, not by the so-called democracy of consumerism championed anything but free West. People learn by suffering, and fundamental change comes through the stimulus of radical pain. At present, many people in the Western world have not experienced enough adversity to make them demand change. Any call for the adoption of sane social and environmental policies still sounds to them like the insane rantings of isolated idealists. Social alternatives. The Dragon Court exists as an organization solely for the bloodline descendants of the ancient Vere family, the senior bloodline successors of the Scythian Merovingian elven house of Princess Melisanu, and for those whose bloodlines are extracted from this descent in its ancient Dragon Court. Such is the nature of its enforced exclusivity that the dragon sovereignty has become the only sovereign body in existence today that demands a DNA test as a prerequisite of membership. The reason is that being a dragon is and always was a matter of race and never a matter of lifestyle choice, regardless of market potentials. Being of the dragon blood is exactly like being a member of the Amerindian Pequot tribe, which, like the court, also demands such rigorous proofs of aboriginality. After 1,000 years of persecution, would anyone dare accuse us of racism? We are fighting for our racial identity to be restored to us, and in this we are no different to the Jews or the American Indians or any other tribe or nation which has suffered at the hands of the European church state. Do we accuse them of racism, or conversely, do we approve of their efforts in attempting to restore and cultivate their cultural distinctness and uniqueness? Like the Indians, the dragons are also sick of having their culture adopted and diluted by the various races and nations that spent so much time and effort trying to eradicate them and other indigenous populations from both the face of the earth and the pages of the history books. Nevertheless, the dragons are committed to furthering the cause of social equity, and whilst desirous of promoting spiritual and scientific education to those who genuinely seek change, ultimately the dragons' concerns lay in the restoration of their own tribes, their own nation, and their own homelands. Well, that's grounds for... that's just unacceptable. Ultimately and unequivocally, the dragons have a love for truth and strive to reestablish their own Twade based on veracity, honor, liberty, and social and environmental equity according to the dragon's ancient lore. They don't want to wedge their toes in your doors, and they don't want to preach their truths at you. They certainly don't want to convert you. Instead, they are working towards the refoundation of their own distinct society, utilizing the sovereign national rights that the ancient imperial and royal dragon sovereignty historically already has. By reintroducing their old social structures and values, the dragons hope to establish a naturally ordained system of socio-economic interactions between the dragon people, based on clarity of vision, honesty of spirit, and material necessity. By avoiding greed and concentrating upon a far richer spiritual and cultural experience derived from the ancient racial memory of the dragon, it is envisaged that its society will be governed by innate conviction. Achieved through teaching the timeless psychological skills that facilitate access to this infinite realm, it is hoped that community might continue as an example of what real royalty entails.
Furthermore, it will demonstrate how communities can work fairly and efficiently with a 100-fold increase in cultural quality, spiritual significance, and personal empowerment. This depends upon them being based not on idealism, materialism, or patriotism, but on sound, realistic principles which are structured organically according to the outworking of the draconian consciousness. The dragons have no interest in politics and no desire to rule the planet, as certain named fools have suggested, not least because history teaches us that in power-brokering terms, the top dog is in fact the exposed duck, and in political arenas, it's duck season all year round. Egotism seeks power through rule, but the dragon's transcendent perception, the derkestai or clear sight, is attained through relinquishing egotism. So dragons couldn't rule anyway. The two concepts would be mutually self-negating. The office of the ancient druidic, or dragon queen or king, was that of a magus, hence majesty, seer, and guide. The idea of a king as ruler, or even the modern president or premier as ruler, is outdated warrior-class nonsense, the disastrous consequences of which can be witnessed across the entire planet. Ultimately, we do not want to be chained to your hamster wheel. The wheel might still be turning, but the rodent has long since died, and the carcass is beginning to stink. In tune with the Dragon Court and the Old Covens, many other groups did not and still do not initiate outsiders as new members, but, echoing Merovingian tradition, only acknowledge family members who have reached a certain age. The overly complex and unnecessary initiation rites found in Wicca or modern witchcraft were and are entirely absent from the rites of small hereditary groups which practiced the old craft. If one knows one is a witch because one is born into a witch family, one doesn't need excessive pomp and hocus pocus to convince one of the obvious. Similarly, it is unnecessary to wear the entire silver standard of a small nation around one's corpulent neck in the form of tasteless pseudo-Wiccan or occult jewelry in order to reinforce the idea to oneself and to others that one is a witch. The structure of the historical covens will be dealt with later. However, the Dragon Court itself is not now and never was a coven in the way that this word is accepted today. When reading this book, this should be borne in mind. Recruitment in times of hardship did occur, and listeners were expected to drink the blood of the officiate. This classical pre-Christian practice was intended to act as a Eucharist, where recruits would take on the nature of the leader by infusing their own being with his or her genetic material. This form of pact lasted 7 years, the approximate time it takes for the body to renew its cells entirely. After 7 years, the recruit would have to drink the blood again, as none of the leader's essence would remain in them after their cellular regeneration. In this way, they were made foot soldiers. However, it wasn't an initiation or for life, as modern Wiccans have perceived induction to be. Anyway, it is doubtful whether they would agree to a vampiric ritual being included into their repertoire, as it might damage their respectable image as white witches, whatever that is supposed to mean, beyond being misinformed, fraudulent pretenders. This is not elitism. For centuries, the ancestors of today's would-be witches, magicians, and New Age gurus raped, tortured, burned, and hanged the elven people. Now they take their names, their titles, and their culture, and use it to enhance their own social kudos, when they cannot even prove that they are of the dragon blood, in the genes. Having said that, anyone who genuinely believes that they have the right to be acknowledged as a draconian, a member of the ancient elven dragon race, is welcome to submit a genealogy which delves back to either Scythian or Mitanni royal houses before the time of Christ. This is at least 80 generations. Unlike self-styled gurus, the Dragon Court, therefore, always seeks to support its claims with substantial scientific evidence. We have been brought up in a scientific age where we are conditioned to demand and accept scientific proofs as the benchmark of validity for any concept presented to us. This is no bad thing, and the dragons themselves have maintained this attitude for centuries. Indeed, such an approach is at the foundation of some of the most poetic and romantic tales in the dragon culture, which at their heart reveal themselves as pure science. The interaction between mind and brain can be psychosomatically suppressed or enhanced by belief. If people are presented with scientific proof of the existence of dragon genes in their own blood, the abilities which accompany those genes and their genetic memory will become accessible in a strange kind of consensual way. Once they believe that it is acceptable to believe what they feared society would condemn as fanciful, they are free. They also experience a previously unperceived sense of clarity. When they do, they will see that most of human endeavor is pointless. They will see a cleaner way to live life and will find that a common, natural social morality will accompany their every waking thought. They will have need for neither man's petty laws nor authorities and masters. The innate laws of life will arise from within, unaccompanied by a love of truth and a contempt for falsehood, pretense, and deceit. They will allow themselves to become what they already were and what the corporate elites fear most: integrated, transcendent, detached, truly intelligent and creative beings, overlords unto themselves, the members of a separate race, a royal priesthood, and a peculiar people and a holy nation. Mere belief is what fuels religion. From absolute proof, however, there is derived absolute certainty in one's condition and one's heritage. Quietly believing or hoping to oneself that one is of the dragon race is one thing. In most cases, the belief, when it wavers, causes numerous blockages to the fulfillment of any potential as the negative spiral circles downward with every waver and every failed attempt. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Knowing beyond any doubt, however, that one is of that blood opens wide the doors to the infinite. The planet needs its elves back, so the saying goes. It needs the people for whom order and empathy come instinctively. It needs those whose love of the natural world comes before all else, and arises spontaneously from the depths of their eternal souls. Above all, the planet needs its firstborn to know who they are themselves. It should be said that the symbolism throughout the entire book is not part of some occult mystical philosophy. If it appears mystical now, it is because we credit our ancestors with little intelligence or knowledge. Experts say that technology, and hence man's understanding, was primitive regardless of the fact that the Greeks discovered the atom and understood the basis of jet propulsion, whilst the Kabbalists were among the first mystics to present the Big Bang Theory. We believe that they couldn't have known about endocrinology or psychobiology. We view their obscure writings and symbols as primitive scribbles. We are not encouraged to relate it to a scientific basis because our culture dissuades us from attributing such to these predecessors. Nevertheless, if you strip away the deliberately planted establishment combinations of superstition, fear, and devil worship engendered by centuries of Roman Catholic hatred and envy, you will find that the dragon people weren't occultists but scientists. This is the most threatening aspect of their culture as far as the church is concerned. Dragon philosophy is based on tangible essays, while Catholic dogma is based on manipulated nonsense, the philosophy of which is totally ungrounded and illogical. The logic of dragon science was the threat. In any case, the church's priesthood was neither of the blood nor privy to it, and therefore not in control of these secrets. Even if they could understand them, they were not able to utilize them for the following reasons. As discussed, dragon philosophy is appropriate only to dragons. In the case of vampirism, and those who would play the ersatz bloodsucker, understand that the essences cannot be taken by force. They are only given in love. If one plays the Hammer House of Horror vampire and abducts young females, A, their systems will react producing chemicals during one's assault upon them that will completely knock out the chemicals traditionally required, and B, one will rightly and inevitably end up in Broadmoor Hospital or some other maximum security psychiatric unit. Kenneth Grant stated in his book The Magical Revival that he felt that people needed to be initiated and gradually educated with regard to this matter. The dragon families would echo his caution, but for purely sociopathic reasons. namely that an outbreak of vampire-related attacks and murders has been reported in recent years, both in Britain and the US. 2 young men in England were jailed in 1994, one for slashing the neck of a 15-year-old boy and drinking his blood. The other, a 29-year-old, was incarcerated for 9 years after attacking a 15-year-old girl and drinking the blood from the wounds he had inflicted. When police eventually tracked him down, a thorough search of his house revealed a book that someone had actually published in which readers were encouraged to drink the blood of young girls for youthful purposes. The young man labeled the vampire rapist was said to be a devil worshipper. Let's bite the bullet here. It may appear exclusionist when it comes to the feelings expressed about people prancing around calling themselves witches or vampires. However, one sees often the sociological results of the kind of media encouragement and advertising that tells people they're all the same and thus can achieve anything they want. A proportion of these people end up subscribing to this and assume it to be a license that extends itself to their becoming a danger to other people. One might then appreciate that a restrictive attitude has some good purpose. Society is encouraged to do what it wants in order that the controlling elite can make money out of selling goods related to conditioned aspiration. We then have a situation where society becomes disaffected and disintegrated because the people themselves cannot achieve what the American dream says they can achieve. Mostly this unrest arises as a consequence of the majority simply not having the money to spend on fashionable, useless rubbish. However, if people transpose this aspirational mentality into changing into people that they cannot become, there will be a buildup of resentment and social tension. It is called the politics of envy. The 29-year-old mentioned had apparently read a book written by someone who had no knowledge of his subject. This self-styled guru of the occult supplied information publicly that resulted in at least one serious maiming incident that could easily have resulted in murder. And what's the point? Young girls today are encouraged to behave like louts because loutish girls buy fashionable clothes and alcohol and do a roaring trade for the music industry. If you removed the abrasive and unattractive exterior brainwashing of this modern female fashion victim, deep down inside you would probably find nothing more than a conditioned breeding machine having a bit of a larf before it settles down to the next stage of its existence as an efficient consumer producer. What you would not find is the spirit of the Ancient of Days, the essential genetic makeup of the Dragon Princess and the Grail Maiden, that rare living goddess whose sacred essences were shed joyously in the service of the ancient vampiric queens and overlords. These days, any solicitous behavior, either violent or wheedling therefore, is not going to result in any would-be vampire extracting anything of value out of the modern young woman. She lacks the brain chemistry, and the intender lacks the brain physiology or anatomy to process the chemicals. The whole transaction or incident is therefore a waste of time. The young man cited here was described as a devil worshipper, and he got that completely wrong as well, as we shall see. It is all and only a matter of chemistry. If you go attacking people, their bodies discharge heaps of poison like adrenaline, noradrenaline, and histamine. Keep attacking people to drink their blood, and you will drink yourself into stress and an early grave. The process actually ages you, so drinking the blood of young girls for youthful purposes by hacking their necks open in a surprise attack is not particularly bright thinking, is it? Any vampiric interaction only worked with enthusiastically willing females of pure royal blood who were virgins of a certain age and head over heels in love with the vampire. This precludes any potential advantages that might be anticipated in hanging around in dark alleys with a questionnaire and a blood testing kit. It could take years to find the right victim. In summary and final reiteration, one cannot utilize dragon essences unless one has the same complementary, genetically inherited brain wiring as the princess who donates them. If one doesn't have dragon synapses, dragon blood won't make the connections. One cannot obtain these essences from just any female. Therefore, any form of play-acting, pose or vampirism practiced by the bored, inadequate, chattering classes today is just a manifestation of Freudian sexual psychosis. Rare is the woman one would worship, but nevertheless, all women deserve respect. So again, I think he's a little like, I don't know, there's some It's fucking weird. It's questionable. But at the same time, there's like some points made that I've never seen anywhere else, you know? Or, I don't know, it's just... I thought it was worth reading. And I really like his whole, like, history of the dragon and the vampire, meaning, like, vortex, or, like, whirlpool. Makes me think of Doth. And, let me get to this other chapter. So wait, the origins of vampirism. Yeah, and the letter V comes up in that, well, the idea of the cone as that nested strange loop comes up in I Am a Strange Loop. And the whole V, Vav, for like Yod He Vav He, Crowley's Horus, and then the funnel effect, which I'll get into in the next post, all kind of connects, because again, the vortex. So that gives a sort of background to his thinking and like where he's coming from, I guess. If that helps at all. Alright, Dragon's Deep. Edmund Spenser is said to have flattered Queen Elizabeth I by writing a poem dedicated to her called The Fairy Queen. However, it is equally possible that this was a veiled reference to the fairy wife of the alchemist, the Earl of Desmond. Spenser and Sir Walter Raleigh resided at his seat, Castle Matres, during an expedition to retrieve the wizard's library from a war zone on behalf of Dr. John Dee. Castle Matres, or Matres, or Matrix as it is known now, was said to have been named after the Matres, or triple goddess. The castle rests on the banks of the River Deal in the county Limerick, and the library which was housed there is said to have contained singular works on magic and alchemy. These were works that Dee didn't want, under any circumstances, to fall into the Queen's hands. The reason for this was, as Lawrence Gardner has pointed out, that Dr. John Dee, Edward de Vere, Francis Bacon, Edmund Spenser, and William Shakespeare et al. Were well aware that the Elizabeth's house was full of badly bred usurpers. Also, despite the descent from Margaret of Anjou, the blood was not pure. I wonder what the boys would have made of the successive generation of farmers made monarchs. Which, yeah, again, go read all those other chapters that I just skipped over, because there's a lot in there that I think is worth at least considering for like future other information, you know. Plantagenet descent and the fairy blood that ran in the veins of Edward III in particular appears to have been greatly desired to legitimize the subsequent claims of the dynasties that superseded them. However, the Plantagenets themselves, and Edward I in particular, looked to Scotland to legitimize their own claims to kingship. Scottish and Irish dragon kings were invested on the Stone of Scone. This stone, the Lia Fail, the Stone of Destiny, or Fate of the Tuatha De Anu, once rested at the summit of the hill of Tara, the ancient seat of the Elven High Kings in the county Meath. When the Milesian Dalriada left Ayr for Scotland, it was believed that they took the Lia Fail with them. Edward I used his best efforts to conquer the Scots and wrest from them the Lia Fail, the ultimate symbol of royal legitimacy. This confirms, one suspects, his right to fairy kingship, which, retrospectively, he had anyway. He was thus wasting his time. The Stone of the Elves never once rested under the gilded commode, Westminster Abbey. Because the Raven Stone of the Phoenicians wasn't the Stone of Scone that Edward I stole, this fake lump of rock that the English thought was the Lia Fail was nonchalantly and unceremoniously driven up to Edinburgh Castle in the back of a Land Rover. Even select members of the Order of the Golden Dawn knew this over 100 years ago, and descriptions of the Lia Fail can still be found in the literature of their successors. Part of the later Plantagenet ancestry included the descendants of the Danish Jarl Rollo Duke of Normandy. The senior Angevin dynasty, the Vere, also had the Viking Rollo as an ancestor in the female line. The word Viking has been explained in various ways. Originally spelt wicking, it was thought to derive from the word wick, meaning the inlet or mouth of a fjord, whilst the earlier meaning of the word from the Old Frisian and Old English had wick as an encampment. In Russia, however, the vicar was a whirlwind, a manifestation of the Zmei or dragon king, which is dealt with later. The vicar is a character which is common to both the Russians and Irish. It will be remembered that Russia was actually founded by the Viking Ruotsi clan, intimating that the actual definition of the word Viking is the same as the Irish word Sumer, a dragon, and a vortex. Anciently, and so again, remember that like the ley lines or dragon lines are energy channels on the earth, so the whole magnetic field of Malkuth. Anciently, the Danes and the Danann were closely related, and an examination of the royal clan in both cultures will reveal the same egalitarian system of self-regulation that distinguished the Grail from the rest of Celtic society. The similarity does not end here. Like their fairy cousin defenders in Ireland and Scotland, the Danes' warriors were utterly indifferent to death and fought without mercy. Their overall belief system engendered behavior that appears to have been almost nihilistic and devoid of any moral conflict. This system, based on the 9 worlds or emanations of being, was duplicated in earlier or contemporary variants of the Kabbalah and Kala Tantra. As with the former, where the spheres or sephira were incorporated into the Hebrew tree of life, the Viking spheres or worlds were thought to rest within the branches of a tree, which in the Norse was called Yggdrasil, the world ash tree. Yggdrasil's roots were embedded in hell or in the underworld, whilst its branches rushed against the stars of heaven. And since that page is gone in the PDF for whatever reason, Yggdrasil is a shamanic glyph which represents the macrocosm, the universe, both subtle and material, and the microcosm, the human body. The tree glyph itself in all cultures represents the path the shaman takes from roots embedded in matter, up the trunk and into the branches and the stars, to the rarefied spiritual spheres and beyond, to unite with Godhead itself. So again, the Godhead, 111, loops back in Malkuth. Such a journey inevitably must transcend mundane care, fear, greed, opinion, or morality, and he or she who embarks upon and completes such a journey successfully becomes united with the one unmanifest, the true will and the total self. As we shall see later, the tree is actually a woman, a goddess incarnate or avatar. The individual who completes the journey is beyond mortal conditioning or the short-sighted relativity upon which is based human moral law. This system and its results duplicate themselves in many other mystical systems, and in early witchcraft in particular. Perhaps, therefore, when considering the behavior or attitudes of the individuals in cultures such as those of the Danes and the Danann, it might be more apposite if scholars took more into account the effects that philosophical systems like these actually had on people like the Norse. They could then rethink the etymology of the word Viking or Viking before settling on an answer that smacks of over-specialization. In tandem with their Aryan Hindu cousins, the Vikings used the symbol of the swastika. An example of its utilization by the Norse can be found in Iceland, whose early inhabitants emblazoned the blue swastika sacred to Kali Azura or Blue Kali, the sister of the Sumerian Cain or Cain. Variants of this figure, the hammer of Thor, earlier a copper single-headed labrys or tomahawk, common to the Ubaid, which is the shape of spinning and creating the vortex, the spiral storm or tornado, can also be found at numerous archaeological sites, including Newgrange in its early spiralized form. This is the spiral design of the Sumer of Sumeria. In its variant form, the swastika represents the curved Scythian sword reaping the whirlwind. And so again, the Typhonian current, the powerful Typhonian wind, the flaming sword, all 777, which is symbolic of, again, that Typhonian current, and also the Sabbath, Ha-Shabbath, the Sabbath of the witches, which again, the week, the whirlwind, or samsara. The swastika is also found reversed, and both forms respectively are thought to be moon and sun symbols. As the author will continue to reiterate, when reading on such subjects, particularly in relation to the philosophy of the Druids and other Indo-European Aryan philosophies, it is wise to bear in mind that the teachings and symbols operate on both the macro and microcosmic levels at the least. Often, the symbolism is in fact multifaceted. In the case of the swastika, the moon and sun symbolism applies inasmuch as the sun radiates or pushes energy out, whilst the moon draws energy to it in the form of the sun's rays. Its gravitational field also pulls the tides. So again, 666 being the swastika, but also the 256, or that 16 times 16 field, and the supreme kala that emanates from that. It's all pretty much, it's got a practical value to it. It's just all superimposed, so it's confusing. The figure of Kali is the Sumer, the whirlpool, which is the sucker in of blood and energy, and like the moon, it draws the sun's rays and sucks up the tide. So again, 333 as Sobek or Karanzan, the gatekeeper. It's also, the Mitsudomo, the whirling symbol. The solar swastika symbolizes the donor or benefactor who gives willingly of their essence. If we look closely, we will also notice that the circular swastika is the mark of Lilith given to Cain, and also the mark of Kali. In their original form, they represent the scythe of the reaper, the golden sickle of the druid spinning on its hilt. Therefore, figure 8 is also figure 9. The swastika has also a three-armed form, which appears again, also the 777 as the Antakarana. Appears at Newgrange, and also the badge of the fairy king Manannan Mac Lir, Lord of the Isle of Man, and the Lord of the Waters of the Sea. As figure 11, it compares to the dragon's eye of the south, figure 12, and also figure 13, the dragon's eye of the north. In the northern hemisphere, mimicking the pull of the whirlpool, the rotation of these devices is to the left as you look at them, or clockwise from the point of view of the one summoning the Sumer in themselves. So again, it also connects to Ursa Major, the Great Bear, again the 7 stars in the 7 days. Godfrey Higgins in Anacalypsis talks about the 7 days and 666. I'll have to find that somewhere and go deeper into that. But if we think of the swastika as being a turbine, the position of the arms, either figure 5, 6, 11, or 13, indicates not the direction of rotation, but the angle at which the blades are set. So again, this has some weird connections. The difference between the 4 and the 3-armed swastika is that the 4-armed especially represent the sowing or reaping of the 4 winds, the pneuma, the spiritual or morphic energy, whilst the 3-armed cross, the swastika of Manyanan, or the waters, represent sowing, donating, or reaping, removing the blood and waters of the fountain of life, the Holy Grail. The pineal gland is so called because it's similar in shape to a pine cone. The dragon's eye of the north, figure 13, looks similar to the plan view of a 3-sided pyramid and also represents the pineal gland that controls the secretion of the mystical fluids. In relation to the pineal gland, the grail is symbolized by the sacred head, the Baphomet or source of wisdom. Related to the solar disk in the Anya chakra and Tantra, in Mithraism, this stage of the grail process is represented by the dragon of the sun. Therefore, here the 3-armed swastika is the dragon's eye of the north, representing the pinecone shape of the pineal gland and also the 15th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Ayin, the 15th path of the tarot, the devil, and the number of Ishtar or Venus in the role of the seniority of the gods. The Ayin is the all-seeing eye of God, or Anya, Enki, or Samael, peering both in and out of the void. At the end of their journey from the brain through its 3rd ventricle down the spinal column to the womb, Grafenberg gland, and urethra, the fluids rest here until naturally or manually discharged. The womb becomes the grail cup containing the waters of life. So again, the cervix and also the Grail O. The cubic stone of the philosophers, the dragon's eye of the south, the cup. Thus, the Grail, amongst other things, is both head and the cup, or is both the head and the cup, and both eyes of the dragon, north and south, are the eyes that contain the light that illumines the human spirit. It is also the pineal gland, the delta, or Hebrew daleth, or tau, the doorway, or so the final hay, the doorway to the eternal. In any form, the swastika is an emblem of life, of breathing, the breath of ravens, and of self-sacrifice. As such, therefore, the swastika is one of the primeval symbols of priest kingship and dragon maidenhood. And so again, he associates here the swastika with the Magen David, and again, the Magen David is 107, which again, it's the Leophale, the Danan, all this stuff is, it's all the same, and once you see it through the universal language. In any form, the swastika is an emblem of life, of breathing, the breath of the ravens, and of self-sacrifice. As such, therefore, the swastika is one of the primeval symbols of priest kingship and dragon maidenhood. Greatly to be abhorred, then, is the fact that the Nazi Party of Germany hijacked the swastika of Kali and, along with numerous other fairy symbols, made it the most hated and feared glyph on the planet. The death's head of the SS is the head of wisdom of the Templars, the Baphomet, whilst the Sig rune itself is the path of the serpent of wisdom descending the tree of life. So again, and also the flaming sword. The red banner with the white circle and black swastika represents the bloody funeral ground of the Aryan saints. They gave the last drop of their life's blood to Kali, represented by the white disk of the moon amidst the crimson field of the banner, and whose swastika is the Sumer, drawing life into it as the moon draws the seas to her. The red flag is thus intended to represent the self-sacrificing tantric priests of the Kalavama Marg, shedding the last vestige of their egos in their lives, to be left drained. As empty vessels, they were then ready to be filled with the wisdom of the cosmos and the power of the Siddhis. And again, Siddhi. In practice, however, the swastika represents the suffering of 4 million people, or 6 million, give or take, sacrificed to the stupidity of a nation duped into thinking that a dysfunctional Yiddish house painter and a disaffected chicken farmer leading a doomed race of potato peasants could really be the vestige of the Aryan peoples, their so-called master race. And as I have already said here, the Judaic culture at its very root and heart is Aryan in origin. Its ancient gods and goddesses were Aryan, its iconography is Aryan, its mythology is Aryan, and its royal house was Aryan. Even the hated so-called Star of David, properly Shield of David, is a form of the swastika. From the following chart demonstrating the Grail myth of the Lady Marcella, the reader will see that the Death's Head, beloved of the Nazis, is equal and identical to the Shield of David in a precise hermetic sense. Those recalling the Templar myth of Mericlea will remember that the skull is male whilst the crossbones are female, in much the same way that the triangle on its base is the male alchemical symbol of fire, the triangle on its point is the female alchemical symbol of water. Combined, we see that they comprise the exoteric international symbol of Judaism. And I've been studying Buddhism a lot, and it's funny that Judaism and Buddhism are both 131, which is the number of Pan, and so that makes you think of like the universe or nature or panorama. And so Catholic, using Gimel, is also 131, which just means universal. And I just found that all crazy. Anyway, now the swastika in exoteric Hinduism is split into two arms, one being female and one being male. They too represent the magical elements of fire and water combined, and thus the swastika is exactly one and the same as the so-called Star of David. And here lies the utter stupidity of racist ideology and jingoism. The Jewish Holocaust replicates exactly what happened to the Elven families for over 1,000 years and for exactly the same reasons: money and power and stupidity. The fairy progeny in small pockets spanned the earth from as far distant as Japan to Scotland. The Ainu of Hokkaido, or North Island, are a tall, fair-skinned Caucasoid people, thought to have been the original inhabitants of the Japanese islands who were driven north by waves of immigrants from China, Korea, and South Asia. The Ainu, pronounced Ainu, are animistic and shamanic and share many beliefs with the Amerindians and the Scythian Druids concerning the nature of life. Their principal divine totem is the swan. Hamsa 107. During the 12th century, the Ainu were almost extinct following continued hostilities with invaders. Their mythology tells them that their race was saved by a swan which descended from heaven and mated with the last living Ainu lord. This coupling produced the Ainu who still occupy Hokkaido today. They rarely mixed with the indigenous populations who invented their rule and their wisdom. Germans, like any other tribe, would have had their Aryan caste to guide them, but that doesn't entitle a whole nation to consider itself Aryan. The Swan Maidens are the dragon princesses of the Grail, the Scythian Druid queens in the Nordic Andvarenauts. In Irish lore, they can transform from swans into maidens, and so, anthropologically speaking, it would appear. The assertion is supported by academics that the Ainu born of the womb of the Swan Maiden are of the royal elven dragon blood, the blood of Anu. The Ainu have dark hair and almond eyes, and are distinctly Asian despite their complexions. Nevertheless, the remnant of the Ainu who retained pure blood, of which no more than 17,000 are left, are of Aryan extraction. So much for the 20th century blue-eyed, blonde-haired German fantasy. The pure, insular Ainu have more right to the epithet Aryan than any German chicken farmer ever had. Sacred wells and well dressing. The serpent dragon Jormungandr, the encircler, coils about at the base of Yggdrasil, the tree of life of the Viking Kabbalah or nine-world system. At Yggdrasil's roots, there is a pool. In Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, this symbol is repeated as the hazel tree by the well, in which lives the salmon of knowledge. Atop the branches of the hazel tree there sits an eagle who drops a blood-red nut of wisdom into the well 13 times a year. There it is consumed by the salmon of knowledge. Not all sacred or fairy wells were actually water sources. Archaeologists working at numerous sites around Britain have discovered that sites which are often called fairy wells are in fact nowhere near the water table. Closer investigation revealed that these boreholes, as in the case of Minehow and Orkney, were actually Bronze Age ritual chambers on or adjacent to what the locals would term a fairy hill. These chambers were entered via a spiral, flagged stairway descending a stone-lined cylindrical flue or chimney. In this connection, what does that tell us about, say, the Well of Nectan or St. Anne's Well, situated next to the Robin Hood's Hill Labyrinth? In all probability, for ritual purposes, we might conclude that a maiden priestess actually resided in the chamber beneath the hill. She was, we can conclude, the representative of the salmon of knowledge, or Persephone and her pomegranate wine, or the queen of sovereignty and her Derg Flaith, the red beer of kingship. In this respect, the connection between the womb and the underworld is clear, and a host of associations and reinforcements present themselves to the reader. These might lead us to consider what might be buried beneath the tower of St. Michael's Church, which rests atop the Glastonbury Tor, under which is said to be the palace of Alberic or Oberon, the Elven King. We might also wonder whether such chambers were a feature of those sacred hills which are associated with the ritual of king-making. Real wells and trees eventually became the focus of devoted rituals that we know now as well dressing. This was a misunderstanding of the idea that the tree and the well were figurative and that their curative properties were obtained not from well water, but from something entirely different. Because these waters were considered therapeutic and rejuvenating, the wells were blessed and venerated. One supposes that in order to make the forgotten approximation closer to the reality of the symbol, the trees adjacent to these wells were decked in colored patches of cloth. These symbolized the chakras or sephira of the tree of life of the female body, which the Druids were really symbolizing in their use of the tree and the well glyph. In the case of the Gaelic form of Yggdrasil, the nut of the hazel represents the pineal discharge. As discussed, dropped by the eagle representing the spirit of the sun god Lu, the Anya Chakra, or Kether Sephiroth, it descends through the tree of life like the lightning bolt of inspiration and falls into the well or womb. Here it is consumed by the salmon of knowledge. In the Irish story, it is Nectan, meaning pure one, the god of waters, who catches and eats the salmon, a euphemism for cunnilingus. Repeating the entreaty of the Grail story, however, it is only the pure one who may see or benefit from the Grail, which is here, as anywhere else, the female genitalia and the mysterious essences they bestow. This story and its variants can be found across Europe in one suppressed or hidden form or another. Whilst the eagle represents the spirit, we are clear on the nature and identity of the secretions represented by the nut. The spirit was said to be located in the pineal gland by Descartes, who was repeating an ancient Gaelic belief. The salmon, however, represents the vulva resting at the bottom, e.g. beneath or below the womb. Both in contemporary and in classical and historical colloquialism, the fish represents the female vulva. This usage is universal. Well, and also the subconscious. If eating fish is said to be good for the brain, then eating Nectan salmon takes on a whole new meaning for us. The fish crops up as a Christian symbol, that of ichthys, meaning fish in Greek, which Christians believe means Jesus Christos Theos, or Jesus Christ God. And on the subject of fish and fish women or mermaids, we enter the labyrinth. The labyrinth. There was a crooked man, and he walked a crooked mile. He found a crooked sixpence against a crooked stile. He bought a crooked cat, which caught a crooked mouse, and they all lived together in a little crooked house. We have discussed the nature and identity of the dragon queens and kings as witch lords, vampires, elven queens and kings, fairies, and seers. It is now time to place them into context of their true homeland and take a closer look at their mystical realm. In German Hermetics, the Kabbalistic tree of life, usually a hexagonal figure, is also depicted as a series of 11 concentric circles. The outer circle represents Malkuth, whilst the inner circle represents Kether. Within this last circle should be inserted another representing Ein Sof Or, the eternal wisdom or the limitless light. This penultimate sphere, Kether, as Kabbalists will reiterate, is also Malkuth on a higher or purer level. So again, the 111 being just an extension of the one. What this means simply is that once one has attained enlightenment, one understands that the beginning of the journey is also its end, and that paradise, eternity, heaven, elfame, bliss, or whatever, is and always was right here on earth. In Mithraic terms, one slays the world bull of finite perception and releases the fertility of eternal life from its corpse. It is the slaying of the Minotaur in one's self and the attainment of the maiden Ariadne, or more properly, Sophia, at the center of the labyrinth. This is also the case with the Bray Moor Labyrinth in Hampshire, while the center of this turf Troytown figure is said to represent paradise. At the center of all labyrinths there waits the dragon maiden and her holy blood, who are the physical manifestations of, as well as doorway to, the anima and the eternal. If one appreciates the Sephira of the Tree of Life as circles within circles, then the path on the hexagonal Tree of Life figure, which join the Sephirot to each other, when laid out within the circular figure, become the winding paths of the labyrinth. In the Chartres Labyrinth, the Jerusalem Mile, whose pattern is repeated across Britain and France, one can see the concept of Malkuth and Kether in Malkuth, laid out in the pathways. The labyrinth is a graphic representation of the mile-long crooked path that leads to the true realm of the elves, eternity. Later, we will study the concept of the hexagonal Kabbalistic tree of life, both the realm and the genealogy of the early elven gods, and a representation of the hive or group mind. Here, the hexagonal shape of the tree of life of the rabbis is reminiscent of the earlier hive configuration of the genealogical Phoenician Kabbalah, a shape repeated in the domed beehive-shaped hermitages of the early Irish monks. The crooked path to the land of Elfame, the king of the elves. The crooked path from Malkuth to Kether also represents the lightning bolt of inspiration that courses through each Sephira on its way from Kether down the Tree of Life to Malkuth, the earth. In the Kabbalah, the path is the lightning bolt, the origin of the Norse Sigrun, often depicted as the serpent of wisdom, spanning and joining heaven or Kether to the earth or Malkuth. The serpent or dragon eats its own tail, and in completing itself becomes the Ouroboros, the Nyx, Naga, or Zero, the Fool of the Tarot, in which is contained everything and nothing. Its tail, which is heaven or eternity, contained and manifest in its clutching mouth, is also made manifest upon the earth, and transcendence is complete. Also known as the alchemist's ring, it is the ancient symbol of the Anunnaki whose name implies when heaven meets earth. In the story of Holger Dansk and Morgan Le Fay, the Ouroboros unites the figure of the ancient Tree of Life as the tree, the dragon maiden, the ring, the grail, and the labyrinth, in a symbol of herogamy so complete that it tolerates no idle interpretations. The word labyrinth has an etymology of which there are two interlinked variations derived from, 1. Labrys, a pre-Hellenic word said to mean double-headed axe, and 2. The Latin labia, meaning lips or folds. The double-headed axe was sacred to Zeus, the Grecan Thor, whose hammer was a variant of the labrys. The spinning hammer was thought to form the shape of the swastika as it flew through the air, whipping up the whirlwind. This whirlwind and the spiral swastika that symbolized it were the figurative progenitors of the stylized maze or labyrinth. Nevertheless, the hammer, shaped like two opposed crescent moons, was, like the labrys, a female emblem. At the highest level, the labyrinth symbol works on several different but interconnected strata, such as the folds of time, the spiral cosmos, the folds of human self-deceit, the journey of life, the brain and the spinal column, the womb and vagina, the tomb or kricher, the vortex or sumer. We will be concentrating upon the vampiric symbolism in relation to samadhi or transcendence. As the Romans, formerly and anciently the Scythian Trojans, continued to follow Hellenic customs, the word labrys would have been known to them. Consequently, the construction of their Latin word labia would have had incorporated into it any of the original suggestions intimated by the pre-Hellenic word labrys. This assertion is borne out by an inspection of the glyph representing the double-headed axe. It is constructed in an hourglass configuration by placing two equilateral triangles of equal dimension together point to point, with the points meeting on the vertical plane equidistant from the two horizontal planes. From the central meeting point of the two triangles, the horizontal line extends out, twice the length of the horizontal sides of the triangle, into the plaster of the walls of the labyrinth at Knossos, and it is this figure, the labrys, which authorities present as giving the Knossos labyrinth its name. With the handle removed and placed upright before the double triangle, we have the figure 18. When the numbers are merged into a monogram, they form the caduceus of Hermes, the phallus of Baphomet, the fennel-stalked thyrsus of Bacchus Dionysus, the fennel stalk in which Prometheus gave the gift of fire to man, and the flying reed stalk of the witches, the original witch's broom. It is also the ribbon-entwined maypole, the serpent's Lilith and Samael entwined around the tree of life, and the rise of Kundalini up the helix-encased spinal cord to the Anya chakra of the brain, all of which the foregoing also represent. The witch's flying reed stalk suggests soaring consciousness in the same way that the caduceus does, which has wings attached to what is thought to be the solar disk. This is actually the Sephiroth corresponding to the brain. The fire given to man by Prometheus might be thought by some to have been the fire serpent Kundalini, who features as a maiden in the service of the evil Klingzor, in the stories relating to Amfortas and the Knights of the Holy Grail. Klingzor represents the perversion of the vampire rite into an act of base sexual lust. He is the aspect of male human nature who, like the Minotaur, represents the danger of capitulation to sexual drives when the knight, like Theseus, is presented with the true quasi-erotic nature of the Grail in the form of the virgin vulva. However, Kundalini promotes the production of noradrenaline and the sexual hormones which work in direct opposition to the Grail, and if the pilgrim allows his baser nature to prevail, the Grail will destroy him by producing in him the opposite hormonal response to that which engenders wisdom and spirituality. In the story of Amfortas, Kundalini realizes her true function and dies to become a former physiological capacity in which she was ever active in the service of Klingsor. Therefore, she becomes passive and receptive to her other, deeper spiritual role, and capitulates to the service of the Grail, symbolized by her Etspiri at the Fisher King's feet. This simply means that she, the spinal column, accepts her role as the conveyor of Grail chemicals from pineal to the womb, instead of only sexual ones from genitals to the brain. With the expansion of knowledge in the science of endocrinology, it is possible now for the informed outsider to restore these stories to their original meaning. So the fire of Prometheus is not the fire of Kundalini going up the spine to the brain, but the fire of wisdom going down the spinal column to the womb to become starfire, which is shed from thence and drunk in the rite of the vampire, which is later on in this book. The double triangle labyrinth design, identical with the one found in the Labyrinth of Knossos, but without the handle, was used up until medieval times to denote the womb and vagina. One of the medieval sexual talismans incorporated into the Clavicula Salomonis, or the Key of Solomon, includes this axe head glyph as a representation of the female principle encircled by the Latin phrase exeat et replit terram, taken from Genesis. The talisman cited was used to attract female lovers, and one might speculate for what purpose precisely. Certainly no purpose that would serve a vampire. The genital outlet is therefore quite clear, and whether the word labyrinth is derived from either labrys or labus, it strongly indicates that the maze or labyrinth was originally a graphic representation of the womb and vaginal channel, at least on one level of relationship to any attendant symbolism. The Labyrinth of Knossos, or Gnosis, is thought to be a later version of the temple labyrinth of Amenemhet, 1818 to 1772 BC, built at Fayum. This was a mortuary temple complex consisting of some 3,000 rooms and halls resting beneath the shadow of the Pyramid of Hawara, or the shadows of the Pyramid of Hawara, a name which itself is reminiscent of the ancient Sumerian dragon queen Hawa of Elda, who was an ancestor of the builder. The Hawara labyrinth was adorned with the carvings of the dragon god Sobek, to which the labyrinth was principally dedicated. This is not surprising when one learns that Hawara, formerly Arsinoe of Ptolemy, was also named Crocodilopolis, the cultic center of the veneration of this Egyptian dragon god of sovereignty and the protector of the royal caste. This was also the Sumer of Sumeria and the Scythians. The 22 kings of Egypt of the 12th dynasty met there, and it is within the precincts that this palatial labyrinth that Amenemhet's daughter Sobek Nefru held the royal dragon court. Although vast in size, it was not unique, as many pyramids themselves had labyrinths built into their structure. We are reminded of the nature of pyramids as sacred mountains, echoing Egypt's cultural origin in an earlier mountainous region of Eurasia, and we will also remember that the sacred hill of the Ogdoad and the links between the pyramids, raths, cities, tells, tepes, kurgans, and ziggurats. The labyrinth, like the pyramid and its collaterals, is thought to be a development of the idea of the mountain cave itself, and examples in support of such a theory are to be found in the intricate passages and designs of Paleolithic sanctuaries. As we know, each of the pyramids and their related structures had funerary and living quarters which were representations of the cave in the mountain. From the king's or queen's habit of living in these funerary buildings, we obtain the myth of the vampire as one of the undead. Labyrinths have been discovered as far afield as Siberia, northeast Russia, and Wales. This suggests strongly, because of the locations, that the concept was of a fairy origin. In support of this theory, we find in Iceland various turf mazes and labyrinthine stone structures called Volsunghausen, or Wayland's homes. Wayland or Alberic, Aubrey, or Oberon, was also called Lauren, and this name, meaning a bay tree, has a double entendre when it is translated as passage in relation to the maze cult. A spiral path can be trod to the top of Glastonbury Tor, which is said to be the home of Oberon. Frequently, these structures are associated with barrows. Atop one of these outside St. Anne's Well, a sacred site dedicated to Black Annis, in Nottinghamshire there is a turf maze named Robin Hood's Race. It is virtually identical with another which was sunk in a depression at the top of the Fairies Hill, a barrow outside Assenby, Yorkshire. The custom of treading the Assenby maze in the evening and sitting in the center to hear the fairies sing was recorded as late as 1908. The design of these mazes, which are of considerable antiquity, some say Bronze Age, have lately been called shepherds' races, many with a distinct spiral pattern towards the center of the structure, and were copied by the church during the medieval period. The labyrinths at Chartres and other numerous other churches in France, Germany, Spain, and Great Britain are of an identical design with these far more ancient mazes, which invariably were placed adjacent to or in the midst of originally prehistoric sacred sites, often forming the center of the groves. The labyrinth of Chartres Cathedral, built by the Knights Templar in the 13th century, like many ritual mazes, has no blind alleys or fake routes. At its central there is a six-petaled Plantagenet, or wild rose, carved into which there seems to be an M figure reminiscent of the symbol of Virgo, which is the M for Our Lady, the Virgin Mary Magdalene, to which the ichthys or salmon of wisdom has been appended, denoting the genital nature of the whole glyph itself. As the maze is situated in a cathedral dedicated to Notre Dame, it seems appropriate to think of it in these terms as the womb of the Virgin. The rose garden symbolism of the core of the labyrinth of Chartres is an echo of the Garden of Solomon and the Rose of Sharon, meaning blood of the Virgin Princess, and also of the later forest labyrinth of Melusine, with its fountain mentioned in medieval French literature. The Labyrinth of Solomon is in fact a medieval alchemical symbol, doubtlessly denoting the scented fountain garden of Sheba. In the French stories, Melusine lies in hiding at the center of her maze garden, waiting to prey on victims returning from the pilgrimages to the Holy Land. She would draw them in and drink their blood. Conversely, she also lay at the center of the maze as the prize of the quester for the Grail. The center of the maze incorporated a black cubic stone from which spurted the waters of life, La Fontaine des Soufs, and the blood of the virgin womb. At Chartres, the rose in the center of the maze can be seen bathed in the sanguine light of the sun beaming through a strategically placed pane of red stained glass, making the combined Grail symbolism apparent. Gematria is a system whereby attributive numbers are added together to give the lowest figure and thus reveal the essence or spirit innate in any particular beings, words, higher numbers, or objects, to which there have been traditionally attached a numerological component. It was an integral part of Hermetics and Kabbalah, which was used extensively as part of sacred geometry in many Templar buildings. The Chartres maze was also called the Jerusalem Mile and was used as a symbolic substitute devotion in place of an actual pilgrimage to the Levant. The mile, though here only suggestive, is 1760 Roman yards, which when added together geometrically gives 14. The multiple component of the mile is times 3, as the mile is measured in yards or 3 feet spans. In order to calculate the number of feet in a mile, one multiplies 1,760 by 3, which gives 5,280 feet. In reality, the maze path is far shorter, but the inference is implicit. In actuality, it actually measures 150 yards, which was a Gaulish measurement of 1,500 paces called luca, luga, or luva. The term is remarkably close to lucca. Professor Margaret Murray states that this god was one that the reputed royal sacrifice William Rufus invoked in oaths. Luca, or lucca, is related to Loki and Lucifer, the bringer of light, also known as Mazda or Ormuzd. The cult of the mistletoe bard and his journey to the Elysian labyrinth of Persephone is clearly documented in the author's notes on Kai Op Emrys and the Vere Dying Kings. If one multiplies the geometric sum of a mile 14 by the number of feet in a yard 3, one obtains 42, the diameter of the maze. In the medieval period, 3 types of calendar were used: solar, lunar, and terrestrial. The calculations of both solar and lunar calendars are well known. Geometrically, the symbolic Chartres mile, if it actually were a mile in feet, added together would give 15. This is the number of the path of the devil, or Baphomet, the head of wisdom, the skull and crossbones, the androgynous god of the Templars, Mercury Venus or Hermes Aphrodite, whose combined male and female gender celebrates entheia, herogamy, or divine union. However, it is 150 yards, which added geometrically amounts to the same thing, 15. 150 yards is 450 feet, which adds to 9, Nikesh, the tripartite triple goddess of the love that is death, and the vampire Sumer, the spiral serpent of the vortex, or the viper, Le Voivre. When the Catholic faithful walked the symbolic 5,280 feet of the Jerusalem Mile, as the maze is called, Kabbalistically and geometrically they were following the path of the devil and walking down the road to damnation, hell, or the backwards way. The actual measurements used vary from modern scales, but the component measurements remain the same. The scale used was medieval, and the diameter was 42 old feet, each comprising of 11.5 inches per foot, which still relates to Venus and the cubit stone, Melusine, and so forth, without actually changing the meaning of the design. This measurement also seems to be a regularly occurring standard for early turf mazes in Britain. The Chartres maze was probably based itself on earlier patterns associated with Melusine and Sheba, which themselves were based on the swastika, the preeminent glyph of the vortex, or Sumer, the sucker in, and source of life and life's blood. Associated with this is the concept of the maze as a dance pattern which, similar to the original sacrificial sword dance of the Danes and the Scots, was an echo of the spiraling witches' dance around the vortex and a celebratory rite of the wild hunt. For some, entry into the maze would result in their life being drained away by the virgin occupant, whose repast would pass on to her kind, as she acted as the fountain of thirst, and fed them in turn from her holy blood. In a sense, then, where the Minotaur at Knossos is concerned, who is frequently interchangeable with the Scythian centaur in classical art, he is also representative of the vampire king, thus at the highest level, as a whirlpool attracting and distributing life and life's blood. The labyrinth was both tomb and womb, life-taker and life-giver, in that order. On at least 2 occasions in England, labyrinths have been euphemistically referred to as fish traps, or veers, Norse, Vere.